Hello everyone, in today's video I will be narrating stories that I found off of Reddit. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But without further ado,
let's get straight into these stories.
when I was in college, there was this tiny arcade hidden away in an old mall on the edge of town. It was the kind of mall where half the shops were shuttered, their darkened interiors gathering dust behind for lease signs. The arcade was buried in a corner, a relic of better days when kids would pour in with quarters jangling in their pockets. I'd stumbled across it during my first semester. I was killing time between classes, wandering the mall to escape the November rain, when I saw the flickering neon sign, Retroke. Inside, the air smelled faintly of mildew and burnt circuitry. The machines hummed quietly, their screens alive with pixelated games. But there was never anyone there, no cashier, no other players. It was eerie, but I liked the solitude. One game always caught my attention, Night Chaser. It sat in the farthest corner, next to a soda machine that hadn't worked in decades. The game's screen showed a lone pixelated figure running through a labyrinth, chased by shadowy shapes. No one seemed to play it, it didn't even have a coin slot. But the game was always on, the figure always running. I started visiting regularly, drawn by the strange quiet of the place. One day, while trying to avoid thinking about an upcoming exam, I decided to give Night Chaser a try. When I touched the joystick, the screen flickered and changed. The pixelated figure stopped running and turned toward me, its small face replaced by a flat, black oval. The screen flashed, "Player 1 ready." I should have walked away, but curiosity got the better of me. The joystick felt cold and stiff under my hand. I guided the figure through the maze, dodging the shadows that pursued it. The game wasn't particularly difficult, but the further I got, the more the maze seemed to twist and distort. The walls began to look less like pixels and more like rough, organic textures, like walls of stone or skin. At one point, I swear I heard faint breathing coming from the machine. The game ended abruptly when one of the shadows caught me. The screen flashed, "Player 1 lost." I backed away, my pulse racing, but when I turned, the arcade was different. The humming of the machines had stopped, and the air was colder. The entrance I'd come through was gone, replaced by a blank wall. I was trapped. I called out, but my voice echoed strangely. It felt like the space was too large for the tiny arcade I knew. And then I saw him. A man stood at the back of the arcade, next to the Night Chaser machine. He was tall and thin, his face obscured by the hood of a dark sweatshirt. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there as if waiting. Hello, I managed to croak. He raised a hand and pointed to the machine. The screen flickered, displaying "Player 2 ready." I didn't stay to find out what that meant. I ran to the far end of the room, frantically pushing against the walls, trying to find a way out. Finally, I slammed into a section that gave way, spilling me out into the damp corridor of the mall. When I looked back, the arcade was gone. The corner was empty, just a boarded up storefront with graffiti scrawled across the plywood. I tried convincing myself that the whole experience had been some kind of waking dream, an overstressed brain conjuring up strange scenarios in a half-empty mall. But deep down, I knew better. Something about it had been too vivid, too visceral. Weeks passed, and I threw myself into school to distract myself. It worked for a while. I didn't tell anyone about what had happened. I doubted anyone would believe me. But even as I tried to push it out of my mind, strange things started happening. It began with the sound. At first, it was subtle, a low hum, almost like white noise, that I'd hear late at night in my dorm. It was faint, but it didn't seem to come from anywhere. No matter how much I moved around the room, it stayed constant, always just at the edge of perception. Sometimes, it was accompanied by a soft, irregular tapping, like someone drumming their fingers on glass. One night, I woke up to the sound of beeping, the same kind of high-pitched tone I'd heard from the arcade machines. When I opened my eyes, I saw nothing unusual, but my laptop was on, its screen displaying nothing but a blank, glowing grid. It wasn't a wallpaper I'd ever used, and no amount of clicking would close it. The words "Player 1 ready" slowly faded onto the screen. I slammed the laptop shut and didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Things escalated from there. I'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, quick, darty shadows that disappeared when I turned my head. Once, while walking back to my dorm after a late class, I saw a figure standing under a flickering streetlight. Tall, thin, wearing a dark hoodie, the same man from the arcade. He didn't move, didn't call out, but I felt his eyes on me. I ran the rest of the way home, my heart pounding. The final straw came a few days later. I was in the campus library, working on a group project with a couple of classmates. We'd booked one of the study rooms, and I was staring at my laptop, trying to focus, when the screen suddenly went black. The grid reappeared, and the words flashed again, "Player 2 ready." My classmates didn't seem to notice. One of them was talking about presentation slides, completely oblivious to the fact that my laptop was no longer functional. When I tried to point it out, they just looked at me strangely as though I hadn't spoken. Then, as I stared helplessly at the screen, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I turned sharply, expecting to see one of my friends, but no one was there. I froze, unable to move, as the words on the screen began to change. You cannot quit. That was the last time I used my laptop. I stopped going to the library, stopped walking anywhere alone. I tried to explain what was happening to my parents, but they chalked it up to stress. Maybe they were right, maybe I was just imagining things. But I knew the man from the arcade was still out there, watching, waited. It's been years since then. I graduated, moved to a different city, and started fresh. I got rid of the laptop and replaced it with a new one. For a while, I thought I'd finally escaped. But last week, I woke up to a sound I hadn't heard in years, a faint hum, followed by that unmistakable tapping. When I turned on my new computer, the screen was black. The words were waiting for me. Player 2 ready. Since seeing the words on my screen again, sleep has become a rare luxury. I unplugged my computer immediately, but it didn't make a difference. The words stayed burned into my mind. It felt like they weren't just appearing on the screen anymore, they were etched into the fabric of my existence. I've tried everything to escape this, deleting my accounts, tossing out electronics, even moving across the country again. But wherever I go, he follows. The man from the arcade, and always distant but always there. I see him in reflections in store windows or standing under broken streetlights. His presence lingers like a shadow just out of reach, a predator biding its time. A few nights ago, I woke up to the sound of an old arcade game starting up. The chiptune music was faint but unmistakable, and it was coming from inside my apartment. I walked into the living room to find my television screen flickering. On it was the familiar grid from Night Chaser, only now the maze looked different. It was no longer abstract pixels, it was detailed, hyper-realistic. The walls looked like the ones in my apartment, cracked paint, the pattern of my wallpaper, even the same framed photo on the wall. The game's figure stood at the maze entrance, and when I blinked, I realized it wasn't the generic, pixelated character anymore. It was May. The screen flashed again, player 1 ready. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. That's when I heard the knock at my door. 3 deliberate raps, slow and heavy. I froze, staring at the door. I didn't want to open it, but the knocking came again, more insistent this time. Who's there? I called out, my voice shaking. No answer, just silence. The third knock came harder, almost like a pounding. Against every ounce of my better judgment, I approached the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the peephole. When I looked through, no one was there, just the dim hallway of my apartment building. But something caught my eye, something near my feet. A single toke rested on the floor. It was identical to the ones from the arcade, tarnished brass with the word RETROCAD etched into it. The sight of it sent a chill down my spine. I didn't pick it up. I slammed the door shut and locked it, retreating to my bedroom with the sound of my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I sat on my bed for hours, waiting for something else to happen, but nothing did. This morning, I finally gathered the courage to check outside. The toke was gone. Now, as I write this, I can feel it watching me. The faint hum is back, louder than ever, filling the room with its electric tension. My laptop, which I've kept powered off for days, turned itself on moments ago. The grid is back on the screen, and the words are flashing again. Final game started. I don't know what happens next. I don't know if I can run anymore. But if you're reading this and you ever see a place called Retrocade, please walk away. Don't touch the machines. Don't enter the maze. This happened a couple of years ago when I was traveling through Europe on a budget. I had found a small hostel in a lesser known town in France, one of those charming places that hadn't yet been completely overrun by tourists. The hostel owner, a friendly woman named Camille, told me about a local flea market that's set up near the old train yard on Ceres. It's small, but you might find something interesting, she said. Intrigued, I decided to check it out. When I got there, the market was just as she described, a few scattered stalls with antique trinkets, handmade jewelry, and secondhand books. It wasn't busy, but the vendors were lively, chatting and laughing with the few visitors. As I wandered from stall to stall, my attention was drawn to an old woman sitting at a table near the back of the market. Her stall was modest, just a few worn items laid out on a dark green cloth. What caught my eye wasn't the items but the woman herself. She had a peculiar presence, with long, silvery hair braided intricately down her back, and she wore an old-fashioned dress that seemed out of place. When her eyes met, she smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was knowing, as if she'd been expecting me. Come closer, she said, her voice smooth and low. I hesitated, but eventually approached her table. On it were several small objects, a tarnished silver locket, a pair of old spectacles, a cracked porcelain doll, and what appeared to be a leather-bound journal. See anything you like? She asked. I felt a strange pull toward the journal. The leather was scuffed, and the edges of the pages were yellowed, but it looked well loved, like it had a history. How much for the journal? I asked. Her smile widened. Oh, it's not for sale, she said, but you can have it. I frowned. I don't understand. Why not give it away. She leaned in closer, her eyes glinting in the late afternoon light. Because it's yours. My stomach dropped. What do you mean? She gestured for me to open it. Against my better judgment, I picked it up. The leather was cool to the touch, and the pages felt brittle under my fingers. I flipped it open and froze. My handwriting filled the pages. Notes, sketches, lists, things I had never written, but undeniably mine. My name was scrawled on the first page, written in a way I used to sign it when I was a teenager. How is this possible? I whispered. She tilted her head, as if amused by my confusion. It's always been yours. You just didn't know where to find it. I shoved the journal into my bag and backed away from the table. I don't want it, I stammered. Her smile faltered for the first time. You can't give it back now. Something in her tone sent a chill down my spine. Without another word, I turned and hurried away, weaving through the market stalls until I reached the main road. I didn't stop running until I was back at the hostel. That night, I opened the journal again, desperate to understand what I had taken. The first few pages were filled with things I didn't remember writing, memories that didn't feel like mine. But as I flipped further, the entries became predictive. They described things I hadn't done yet, places I hadn't been, people I hadn't met. I couldn't sleep at night. The next morning, I returned to the market, determined to give the journal back and get answers. But when I arrived, the train yard was empty. No stalls, no vendors, no sign that the market had ever been there. I asked Camille about it later, and she just frowned. What market? There hasn't been a market near the train yard for years. I thought I could ignore the journal. For months, I kept it tucked away on the highest shelf in my apartment, buried under a stack of old notebooks and papers. But it never truly left my mind. Sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night, I'd find myself staring at that shelf, feeling the weight of it as though it were calling to me. One night, after a particularly vivid nightmare, I caved. I pulled the journal down and sat at my kitchen table, my hands trembling as I opened it. The first page was the same as before, my name written in that unmistakable teenage scrawl. The pages I had read months ago hadn't changed either. They still detailed events I barely remembered or hadn't yet experienced. But as I flipped further, I noticed something new. Near the middle of the journal, the handwriting shifted. It was still mine, but shakier, more hurried. The entries became less like diary notes and more like warnings. Don't trust the man with the silver ring. Leave before the lights flicker. Do not look behind you. Each phrase sent the shiver down my spine. They felt like fragments of a nightmare I couldn't recall, yet they carried an eerie familiarity. Then I turned to the last page. It was blank, except for a single sentence written in bold, jagged letters. She will come for it. I slammed the journal shut, my heart racing. Who was she? The old woman at the market? Someone or something else? I couldn't sleep that night. I kept checking my door locks, peering out the window into the dark street below. The feeling of being watched was suffocating. The next day, I decided I needed to get rid of the journal. I threw it in a trash bag, drove to the edge of town, and dumped it in a public dumpster. But when I got home, it was back on my kitchen table as though I had never touched it. This happened 3 more times. No matter what I did, burning it, burying it, throwing it into a river, it always found its way back to me. The final straw came 2 weeks ago. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of pages rustling. The journal was open on the floor at the foot of my bed, its pages flipping wildly as though caught in a strong wind. I froze, unable to move, as words began appearing on the blank pages before my eyes. Shooter. The air grew cold, and the faint scent of lavender filled the room, the same scent I had noticed at the market. I didn't dare look around. I grabbed the journal, shoved it into a drawer, and didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Since then, strange things have been happening. Lights flicker when I'm alone, and I hear faint whispers in the corners of my apartment. Last night, I woke up to find the journal open again, this time on my bedside table. The writing had changed once more. You can't run forever. I don't know what to do. Part of me wants to confront whatever this is, to find the old woman and demand answers. But a larger part of me, the part that still feels the cold grip of fear from that night, knows it's better to leave it alone. I tried to carry on with my life, but the journal wouldn't let me forget. The whispers grew louder, the lights flickered more frequently, and shadows moved in the corners of my vision. It was as if the air in my apartment was alive with something wrong. One evening, I decided to consult a friend of mine, Daniel, who dabbled in paranormal research. He wasn't exactly a professional, more of an enthusiast, but he had an open mind, and I needed someone to believe me. When I showed him the journal, he was instantly fascinated. This isn't just some random object, he said, flipping through the pages carefully. It feels like a conduit. Something or someone is using this to communicate with you. Can we destroy it? I asked, desperation seeping into my voice. Daniel shook his head, not without understanding what's tied to it. Destroying it blindly could backfire. We need to figure out what it wants or who it's connected to. He suggested a seance, something I was deeply uncomfortable with. but by that point, I was desperate, anything to break the grip the journal had on my life. We scheduled it for the following Friday night at his place, where he had a small, makeshift ritual room. When the night came, I arrived at Daniel's with the journal tucked under my arm. The air felt heavy, and I had the distinct feeling I was being followed. Daniel had set up a circle of candles, a few protective charms, and an old wooden table where the journal would sit. We started the seance by holding hands and focusing on the journal. Daniel asked the typical questions: who are you? What do you want? Why are you tied to this journal? At first, nothing happened. Then, the flames of the candles began to flicker violently. The room grew icy cold, and a faint, raspy voice whispered from nowhere and everywhere at once: "It belongs to her." Daniel's grip on my hand tightened. "Who is her?" he demanded. The voice responded, louder this time: "She waits." The journal slammed shut on the table, the sound echoing through the room. The candles blew out all at once, plunging us into darkness. I fumbled for my phone, turning on the flashlight. When the beam landed on Daniel, his face was pale, his eyes wide. "Something was here," he whispered. "Something powerful." I grabbed the journal and told him I couldn't stay. He didn't argue. As I left, he gave me one last piece of advice: don't open it again. Whatever you do, don't open it. That night, I barely slept. I kept the journal locked in a suitcase, tucked into the closet, but it didn't help. Around 3 a.m., I was jolted awake by a loud banging on my front door. My heart raced as I stumbled out of bed, peering through the peephole. No one was there. The banging stopped, replaced by a new sound, rustling. It was coming from inside my apartment. My stomach dropped as I turned and saw the suitcase on the floor of the living room, the lock broken. The journal was lying open on the floor, its pages flipping wildly. This time, the writing was fresh, scrawled across the pages as if an invisible hand was dragging a pen across them in real time. "Come to the market. She is waiting." The scent of lavender filled the air again, stronger than ever. I backed away, my hands shaking. The journal seemed to pulse with a life of its own, the pages glowing faintly in the dim light. I don't know what to do. I don't even know if I'll make it through the night. But if I disappear, or worse, remember this: if you ever see an old woman at a strange market, don't take what she offers. This happened a few years ago, back when I lived on a small island off the coast. It was a quiet place, just a few hundred residents and one ferry that connected us to the mainland. The ferry ran only twice a day, early morning and late evening. If you missed it, you were stuck until the next day. I was coming back from a work trip and managed to catch the last ferry of the evening. It was late October, and the air was damp and cold, the kind of chill that seeps into your bones. The ferry was nearly empty, save for me, an older couple, and the crew. I decided to stand outside on the deck to enjoy the quiet. The water was black and glassy under the moonlight, and the only sounds were the low hum of the engines and the occasional squawk of a gull. I leaned against the railing, letting my mind wander. That's when I noticed him. A man stood at the far end of the deck, leaning on the railing just like me. I hadn't seen him board, and he hadn't been inside the ferry. He wore a long coat that seemed out of place for the mild weather earlier that day, and a hat that cast a shadow over his face. He was completely still, staring out at the water. Something about him made me uneasy. Maybe it was the way he didn't move or the fact that I hadn't noticed him until now. I tried to brush it off. Maybe he just liked the quiet like I did. But then he turned his head slightly, as if he was looking at me, though I couldn't see his eyes. Slowly, he raised one hand and pointed. At first, I thought he was pointing at the horizon, but as I followed his line of sight, I realized he was pointing at the water directly below us. I took a step back from the railing, unsure of what to do. "Do so," he asked. His voice was soft, but carried clearly over the distance. "See what?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer, just kept pointing. Against my better judgment, I stepped closer to the railing and peered over the edge. The water below was dark, reflecting the moonlight in shimmering ripples. At first, I saw nothing unusual, but then something moved. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, a pale shape just beneath the surface. It swirled and twisted, like a ribbon caught in a current. "What is that?" I whispered, more to myself than to him. "It's waiting," the man said. I turned to look at him, but he was gone. I spun around, searching the deck, but there was no sign of him. The ferry wasn't large. There was nowhere he could have gone without me noticing. My pulse raced, and I hurried inside to find the crew. I told them about the man, but they looked at me like I was crazy. One of them even walked the deck with me to check, but there was no one there. When I got back home, I told myself it was just my imagination or a trick of the light, but I stopped taking the last ferry after that. A few months later, I overheard some locals talking about an old legend. They said that years ago, a fisherman had fallen overboard on a stormy night and drowned. His body was never recovered, but people claimed to see a figure on the ferry ferry, always at night, pointing to the spot where he disappeared. The story of the fisherman stuck with me more than I wanted to admit. After hearing it, I started noticing little things that unsettled me. I'd hear whispers about others seeing the same man I had, always on the last ferry, always pointing. They'd tell their stories in hushed tones at the local cafe or during community gatherings, but nobody ever offered an explanation. The worst part, people began noticing strange things happening after their encounters. A woman claimed her boat wouldn't start the next time she went out fishing. Another man said he lost a night's sleep because he swore he heard knocking on his bedroom window, except his house was miles inland. There were even rumors that someone disappeared after being dared to jump into the water below the ferry at night. By then, I had all but stopped taking the ferry unless it was absolutely necessary. If I had to, I made sure it was the morning run. My coworkers started teasing me about my sudden aversion to the ferry, but I didn't care. I wasn't about to risk another encounter. Then came the night I had no choice. I had stayed too late at a friend's place on the mainland, lost track of time, and missed every other way back to the island. The only option was the last ferry. My stomach churned as I walked toward the dock, the cold October wind whipping against my face. I tried to convince myself I'd be fine. It was just a legend, I told myself, an urban myth to scare locals, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking. When I boarded, I noticed it was quieter than usual. There were no other passengers, just me and the crew. The air felt heavier than I remembered, as though the weight of all the stories I'd heard was pressing down on me. I stayed inside, clutching my bag and staring at the floor, trying not to think about it. The hum of the engines was oddly soothing, and for a moment, I almost relaxed. But then I felt it, a change in the air, subtle but unmistakable. It was colder now, the kind of cold that didn't just touch your skin but seemed to seep into your bones. I didn't need to look to know. He was there. My heart pounded as I glanced toward the door leading to the deck. It was slightly ajar, and through the crack, I could see him standing in the same spot as before, leaning on the railing, pointing. No, I whispered to myself, clutching the arms of my seat. I wasn't going out there. I wasn't going to look. But then, a sound cut through the hum of the engines. It was faint at first, like someone softly tapping on glass. It grew louder and more insistent, and I realized it was coming from the windows near me. I whipped my head around, but there was nothing there, just the endless stretch of dark water outside. The tapping stopped, and for a moment, I thought it was over. But then, a voice, low and hollow, came from the deck. "Do said." I bolted out of my seat and ran to the crew. They were in the cabin, laughing and chatting, oblivious to my panic. I tried to tell them what I'd seen, but the words caught in my throat. What could I even say? That I was being haunted by a man no one else seemed to see. One of the crew members, a kind older man, noticed my trembling hands and pale face. "You alright, miss?" he asked. I shook my head and pointed toward the deck. "There's someone out there. Heads." He's pointing. The man frowned and exchanged a look with the others. Without a word, he grabbed a flashlight and headed outside. I followed a few steps behind, staying close to the door. He swept the beam of light across the deck, but it was empty. "There's no one here," he said, his voice calm but firm. I wanted to argue, to insist that I'd seen him, but then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The railing where the man had been standing was drippy wet, as if someone or something had just climbed aboard. I didn't take the ferry for a long time after that. When I finally did, it was in broad daylight, with as many people on board as possible. I still don't know what I saw that night, and maybe I never will. All I know is that I'd never want to see it again. Life on the island carried on, but I couldn't shake the unease that lingered after that night. The story of the ferryman became an obsession I didn't want but couldn't escape. I combed through every piece of local lore I could find, digging into old newspaper clippings, talking to longtime residents, and even visiting the tiny, damp archives in the town hall. The more I learned, the less comforted I felt. The story of the fisherman who had drowned was real enough, but it wasn't the only tale. Over the decades, there had been whispers of strange occurrences surrounding the ferry and the waters it crossed. A child in the 1960s vanished while playing near the docks. A crew member on the ferry quit suddenly in the 1980s, claiming he'd seen a pale face in the water. And, chillingly, a local diver drowned during a salvage operation. His last words to a colleague reportedly being, "It's trying to pull me under." What was it? No one could agree. Some said it was the restless spirit of the fisherman, while others believed it was something older, something the fishermen of the island had been quietly avoiding for generations. Whatever it was, I wanted no part of it. Months passed, and I began to feel a cautious sense of relief. Maybe I just had a vivid, stress-induced hallucination. The ferryman became a story I told only when someone pressed me about why I wouldn't take the last ferry anymore. Most people laughed it off, though a few gave me knowing, uneasy looks. Then, one stormy night, everything changed. I was home, cozying up with a book and a cup of tea, when I heard a soft, rhythmic knocking. At first, I thought it was the wind rattling the old windows, but as I listened closer, I realized it was coming from the front door. The knock was deliberate, measured. I froze. It was nearly midnight. No one should have been outside, especially not in weather like this. Against every instinct, I got up and approached the door. door. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. No answer. The knock came again, louder this time. I peered through the peephole, but there was no one there, just the dark, rain-soaked porch. My heart pounded as I double-checked the locks and backed away from the door. I grabbed my phone, ready to call a neighbor or the police, but before I could dial, the power went out. The house plunged into darkness, leaving me with nothing but the sound of the storm and the faint echo of knocking. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the corner of my living room with every light I could manage to turn on, waiting for dawn. By morning, the power had returned and the storm had passed. I cautiously stepped outside, half expecting to find something, footprints, a sign of whoever had knocked, but there was nothing. Nothing except a small, waterlogged piece of paper lying on the porch. I picked it up with trembling hands and turned it over. Written in shaky, smudged letters were 3 words: "Do say." I dropped the paper and stumbled back into the house, slamming the door shut. It was him. It had to be. I don't know how he found me, and I don't know why. I've thought about moving, leaving the island altogether, but I can't bring myself to do it. It feels like running won't help, like whatever this is would just follow me. It started as a typical hike, not down a forgotten trail, but on a well-marked path at a local nature preserve. I was on a short vacation and decided to spend some time outdoors. The trail wound through dense trees, the air crisp and the forest alive with the usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves. About 2 miles in, I noticed something odd off the trail. Just beyond a cluster of tall pines was what appeared to be a desk. Yes, a standard office desk, the kind you'd see in a 90-seconds workplace. It was battered, but intact, and completely out of place. Curiosity got the better of me. I stepped off the path and made my way to it. The desk was real, scuffed wood, rusty metal handles, and an empty inkwell perched neatly in one corner. A single drawer remained closed, while the others hung open, their contents long gone. Surrounding the desk were what looked like scraps of paper, though they were mostly decayed from exposure. As I got closer, the forest seemed to go eerily quiet. No birds, no wind, just silence. I reached for the closed drawer, my instincts screaming that I shouldn't, but my curiosity overpowered them. The drawer slid open smoothly, unnaturally so, considering the state of the desk. Inside was a stack of photographs. They weren't faded or damaged like you'd expect after sitting in a forest. They were crisp and clear. Each photo was of a different person, men, women, and children standing in front of various landmarks. The Eiffel Tower, a beach, a bustling market. Their faces were all smiling, but something was wrong. The longer I stared, the more the smiles seemed forced. The eyes of... I flipped through the stack, my unease growing. The final photo was a picture of me, not a younger version of me, not one taken by a friend. It was me, in the exact outfit I was wearing, standing in front of the desk in the middle of the forest. I dropped the photo and stumbled back. That's when I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, like a desk drawer sliding shut. I turned, and the drawer I had opened was now closed again. The silence of the forest felt suffocating. I didn't wait to see more. I ran back to the trail as fast as I could, the crunch of leaves and twigs under my boots the only noise breaking the stillness. When I reached my car, I hesitated for a moment, looking back toward the trailhead. There was no sign of anything unusual, just the quiet forest. For weeks after the encounter, I couldn't stop thinking about the desk and the photo. It felt like I was constantly looking over my shoulder, expecting something or someone to show up uninvited. I tried rationalizing it. Maybe it was a prank, maybe I'd been imagining things, or maybe there was some perfectly reasonable explanation for what I'd seen. But deep down, I knew better. One night, about a month later, I was sitting on my couch flipping through TV channels, trying to distract myself. My phone buzzed with a notification, a text from an unknown number. The message contained a single image, the photo of me at the desk. My stomach dropped. I stared at the screen, frozen, as my phone buzzed again. Another photo. This one was also of me, but it was taken through my living room window. I dropped my phone and scrambled to close the curtains, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grasp the fabric. I stood there in the dark, listening, waiting. Minutes passed, but nothing happened. No knocks, no footsteps, no signs of anyone nearby. When I finally worked up the courage to check my phone again, the texts were gone, completely erased from my messages as if they'd never existed. I told myself I'd imagined it, but the unease stayed with me. Over the next few weeks, small things started happening. Items in my apartment would be slightly out of place, though I lived alone and was meticulous about where I left things. My keys went missing for hours, only to reappear in the exact spot I swore I left them. Once, I woke up to find my front door unlocked, though I was certain I'd locked it before bed. The breaking point came one evening when I returned home from work. My apartment looked normal at first glance, but as I walked into the living room, I froze. Sitting in the middle of the room was the desk, the same desk from the forest. It looked exactly as it had before, worn and weathered, with the empty inkwell perched on top. The drawer was closed, and I didn't dare touch it. Instead, I turned and bolted out the door, grabbing my keys on the way. I drove to a friend's house, barely able to form coherent sentences as I tried to explain what had happened. When we returned to my apartment later that night, the desk was gone. Nothing else was out of place, but the air felt wrong, heavy. My friend tried to reassure me, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. I've since moved to a new city, hundreds of miles away, and changed my number. So far, there's been no sign of the desk or the photos, but I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. It's been over a year since I moved. Life has been quiet, blessedly, almost unnervingly quiet. I've done everything I can to put distance between myself and whatever that desk represented. New city, new job, new routines. I even stopped hiking, something I used to love. It's not worth the risk, but the thing about silence is that it gives your thoughts too much room to grow. No matter how far I run, I can't stop replaying that moment when I saw the photo of myself, or the night the desk appeared in my apartment. I've been careful not to talk about it much, afraid of being labeled paranoid or crazy. But I'm not crazy. I knew what I saw. This morning, something happened that shook me to my core. I was walking to a coffee shop near my apartment when I noticed a man standing on the corner ahead. At first, he seemed like any other pedestrian, just waiting to cross the street. But as I got closer, I noticed he wasn't moving. He wasn't looking at his phone or adjusting his coat. He was staring at me. I slowed my pace, trying not to make eye contact, but something about him kept pulling my attention. He was wearing a dark suit, out of place in the casual neighborhood. His face was gaunt, his skin pale, and his eyes. His eyes were the worst part. They were fixed on me, unblinking, like he knew me. As I passed him, I couldn't help but glance back over my shoulder. He was still standing there, watching. His lips moved, but I couldn't hear what he was saying. It wasn't until I reached the coffee shop that I realized I was shaking. I'd ordered my drink and sat down, trying to calm my nerves. When I left the coffee shop, he was gone, but something was waiting for me instead. Tucked under the windshield wiper of my car was an envelope. No name, no return address, just a plain, white envelope. My first instinct was to throw it away, but curiosity, or maybe stupidity, got the better of me. Inside was a single photograph. My stomach dropped. It was me, walking to the coffee shop that morning, captured from the perspective of the man on the corner. I haven't been able to stop pacing since I got home. Every sound outside feels like a threat, every shadow a potential danger. I don't know how they found me, or why this is happening, but I know one thing for certain: the desk, the photos, the man, they're all connected, and they aren't finished with me. If anyone reading this ever comes across something that feels wrong, something that doesn't belong, whether it's a desk in the woods or a stranger who stares too long, don't ignore it. Don't engage. Just leave. I used to work at a small, local ice rink in a town not known for much. It was tucked away in a quiet part of town, a favorite spot for kids and amateur skaters. My job was simple: lock up after the last skaters left and make sure the Zamboni was ready for the next morning. The rink itself wasn't anything special, a big, cold rectangle surrounded by bleachers. But it had a charm, and regulars treated it like a second home. There was one thing about the rink, though, that always struck me as odd: the faint tapping sound you'd hear late at night when the place was empty. I always figured it was the building settling or maybe water dripping somewhere. It wasn't constant, but it was frequent enough that it became background noise. One winter night, the last skater left later than usual, leaving me alone. I went through my routine, shutting off the lights, checking the doors, and giving the Zamboni a once over. The tapping started again, but this time it was louder, like someone was knocking on the ice from underneath. I froze, listening. It wasn't random. It was deliberate, rhythmic. Nook, nook, pose, nook, nook, nook. It was coming from the center of the rink. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe something was caught in the refrigeration system. Ice expanding, but the sound wasn't mechanical. It was too intentional. I walked to the edge of the rink, my breath visible in the cold air. The sound stopped. I stared out at the empty, glossy surface, illuminated by the dim overhead lights. Nothing moved. But then, faintly, I heard it again, closer this time. Nook, nook. I don't know what possessed me to step onto the ice, but I did. I had my shoes on, so my footing was unsteady, but I carefully made my way toward the center where the sound seemed loudest. As I approached, the tapping stopped completely, replaced by an unnerving silence. That's when I saw it. A small, faint outline beneath the ice, a handprint. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but as I crouched down, I realized it was too perfect, too detailed. The fingers were spread out as if someone had pressed their hand against the underside of the ice. I scrambled backward, heart racing. That's when the tapping started again, loud and frantic, echoing around the rink. It wasn't just one knock now, it was everywhere. The sound came from all sides, overlapping in and growing louder. I bolted for the exit, slipping and sliding as the tapping reached a deafening crescendo. I didn't stop running until I was in my car, engine on and heat blasting. I could still hear the tapping in my ears, like it had imprinted itself on my brain. The next day, I called in sick. I never went back to the rink after that. I couldn't. I never told anyone, either not my boss, not my friends. But sometimes, late at night, I hear that same tapping in my dreams, and I wake up drenched in sweat. A few weeks passed after that night, and I tried to put the incident behind me. I told myself it was exhaustion, maybe my mind playing tricks on me after too many late shifts. But every time I drove past the rink, my stomach churned. I couldn't shake the image of that handprint, perfectly preserved beneath the ice. Then, one morning, I got a call from a coworker, Derek, who still worked there. He sounded shaken. "Hey, have you ever heard anything weird at the rink? Like, noises?" he asked. I froze. I hadn't told anyone about what happened, but his tone made it clear he wasn't joking. "Why, what did you hear?" Derek hesitated before saying, "It's probably nothing. Just some weird knocking sounds. It happened last night when I was closing. I thought it might be the cooling system, but it felt, like it was following me." My blood ran cold. "Did you check the ice?" Silence. Then, "No, why?" I debated whether to tell him, but I didn't want to sound crazy. "Just stay away from the center and don't go alone." That's when he dropped the bombshell. "You know, it's funny you say that. A guy came by the rink yesterday, said he was an old regular, wanted to see the place again. He mentioned something strange, said there used to be a second rink here years ago before it was rebuilt. They drained it after a pipe burst, but some kid went missing around the same time. They never found him." I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. I didn't know whether to believe him, but it explained too much. The tapping, the handprint, it all started to make a twisted kind of sense. I couldn't let it go. I spent the next few days digging into the town's history, looking for anything about the rink or a missing kid. It wasn't easy, records were sparse, and no one seemed to remember much. But I finally found an old newspaper article from the 1980s. It mentioned a boy named Lucas, age 10, who had vanished after ice skating practice. The rink had been closed temporarily for renovations, but no connection was ever made. The case went cold. Literally, I wanted to tell Derek, but when I called him, his phone went straight to voicemail. Days passed with no word from him, and then I heard through a mutual friend that he'd quit abruptly. He wouldn't say why, but I had a feeling I knew. I wish the story ended there, but it doesn't. Last week, I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound that made my skin crawl, tappy. It was faint, but unmistakable, coming from outside my bedroom window. I live on the second floor. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. I finally mustered the courage to peek through the blinds, and there was nothing. Just the empty street below, bathed in the glow of a street lamp. I don't know if it's my imagination, or if whatever was under the ice has found me, but every night, I sleep with the lights on, and I keep a baseball bat by my bed. After that night, I became hyper-vigilant, constantly on edge. Every little noise made me jump, and I started to feel like I was being watched. It was as if the tapping had left a mark on me, something I couldn't see but could feel everywhere I went. I decided to leave town. It wasn't a rash decision. I'd been wanting to change for a while, and now I had the perfect excuse. I packed up everything I could fit in my car and drove 3 states away to a small town where no one knew me. It was peaceful, quiet, and far from any ice rinks. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, not even Derek. For a while, it worked. I got a job at a bookstore, made a few friends, and started to feel normal again. The tappy became a memory, something I could almost convince myself had never happened. Almost. A few months after I moved, I went out for drinks with some coworkers. We laughed, shared stories, and I felt lighter than I had in ages. I stayed out later than usual, and by the time I headed home, it was well past midnight. The streets were quiet, and the only sound was the crunch of my boots on the frost-covered sidewalk. As I approached my apartment building, I noticed something odd. The street lamp outside my building was flickering. It hadn't been like that earlier. I shook it off and headed inside, locking the door behind me. My apartment felt unnaturally cold, but I assumed I left the thermostat too low. I turned it up, threw on a sweater, and tried to unwind. That's when I heard it. Delk. My heart stopped. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, coming from the window in my living room. My apartment is on the 3rd floor. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just stared at the window, waiting for something to appear. The knocking stopped, but then, from the other side of the room, I heard it again. Delk. This time, it was coming from the door. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept since that first night and approached the door as quietly as I could. My hands were trembling as I peeked through the peephole. There was nothing there, just the empty hallway. I backed away, heart racing, and that's when I noticed something. My breath was visible. It was freezing, even though the thermostat rated 72 degrees. Then I saw it, a single handprint on the inside of the window, the same size and shape as the one I'd seen under the ice. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the corner of my bedroom with the lights on, clutching the bat, waiting for the sun to rise. When it did, the handprint was gone, and the room was warm again, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. It wasn't over. Since then, the tapping has followed me. It's not every night, but it's frequent enough to remind me that I'm not safe. I've tried to research ways to protect myself, salt lines, prayers, even reaching out to paranormal experts, but nothing works. I've stopped making friends or getting close to anyone. I'm afraid whatever this is will latch onto them too. My life is a cycle of fear and exhaustion, and I don't know how much longer I can take it. A few months ago, I started a side hustle restoring vintage furniture. I'd often scour estate sales or old shops looking for hidden gems. One Saturday morning, I found myself in a peculiar little shop tucked into the corner of an old industrial district. The sign above read J. Edgar's Stationery and Antiques. Inside, the shop felt much larger than it appeared from the outside. It was dimly lit, with towery shelves stacked haphazardly with everything from typewriters to leather-bound journals. I was the only customer, and an elderly man behind the counter barely looked up from his newspaper. As I wandered, I spotted an antique writing desk against the back wall. It was beautiful, with delicate carvings along its edges and a slight patina that gave it character. But what drew me to it most was its price, only $30. The shopkeeper barely reacted when I dragged the desk up to the counter, aside from muttering, "Good luck with that one." Curious, I inspected the desk more closely once I got home. The craftsmanship was incredible, but one drawer was stuck. I pulled and twisted at it to no avail. Assuming it was warped from age, I decided to leave it for later. That night, I had a strange dream. I was sitting at the desk, but the room around me wasn't my workshop. It was an old, candlelit study with high ceilings and shadowed corners. In the dream, I was furiously writing something, but I couldn't see the paper. I woke up unsettled, but brushed it off as a side effect of binging creepy podcasts. The next morning, I tried the drawer again. This time, it slid open with an unexpected ease that nearly knocked me backward. Inside, I found an old, folded piece of paper. The writing was faint and smudged, but I could just make out the words, "Finish what you started." I stared at it for a long time, a chill running down my spine. What did that even mean? I hadn't started anything. I tried telling myself it was probably some joke or forgotten scrap left by the desk's previous owner, but over the next few days, the desk started to feel rugged. No matter where I moved it, I'd catch its reflection in windows or mirrors and swear the drawer was open, just a crack, when I hadn't touched it. One night, while working late, I heard a noise from my workshop, a scraping sound. Heart pounding, I grabbed a flashlight and crept downstairs. The drawer of the desk was fully open, and the piece of paper was lying on the floor. This time, the words had changed. "Don't leave." I packed up the desk and drove it back to the shop the next morning. The elderly shopkeeper looked up when I walked in, a slight smirk curling his lips. "Did it take you long?" he said, wheezing out a laugh. "What is with this thing?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "It finds people like you," he said cryptically, "people with unfinished business." I left the desk in the shop and walked out without another word. Weeks later, I tried to return to the area to confirm what had happened, but the shop wasn't there. The spot was empty, as if it had never existed. The absence of the shop gnawed at me for weeks. I kept replaying the events in my mind, trying to convince myself it had been a bad dream or some elaborate trick. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, there was one thing I couldn't shake, the feeling that I'd been chosen somehow. I tried to move on, and I threw myself into my work, restoring more furniture, doing my best to avoid pieces with drawers. But strange things kept happening. I'd wake up to the sound of scratching in my workshop, even though nothing was out of place. Objects on my desk would move overnight, a pencil rolling off the edge, papers fluttered as though a breeze had passed through. Once, I woke up to find my laptop open, a blank document on the screen. The cursor blinked as though waiting for me to type something. The dreams returned, too. I'd find myself at the desk again, writing furiously, but now the paper was visible. The words were nonsensical, scrambled letters, symbols, and shapes, but my dream self seemed desperate to get them down. When I woke up, I'd feel drained, like I'd actually been working through the night. Then, a package arrived at my door. There was no return address, just my name scrawled in messy handwriting. Against my better judgment, I brought it inside and opened it. Inside was a single item, the desk drawer. It was unmistakably the one from the antique desk I'd returned to J. Edgar's, down to the carvings on the handle. I felt sick. How had it found me? Andrew said to. I threw it into my trunk, drove out to a remote wooded area, and tossed it into a ravine. That night, I slept soundly for the first time in weeks. But the next morning, the drawer was back. It sat in the center of my workshop, a a silent, accusing presence. This time, the paper inside bore a new message. It's time. I didn't know what it was, but I couldn't ignore the sense that something was building, like a storm on the horizon, just out of sight but growing closer. I started to hear whispers when I was alone, faint and unintelligible, but unmistakable. Sometimes I thought I caught my own name. One night, the power went out while I was in the workshop. In the pitch darkness, the whispers grew louder, circling me, overlapping until they were an unbearable cacophony. I fumbled for my flashlight, but when I turned it on, it wasn't the workshop I saw. I was back in the candlelit study from my dreams. The desk was there, waiting for me. A piece of paper and a quill sat on its surface. I didn't want to sit down, but my legs moved on their own, dragging me toward the chair. My hands reached for the quill, trembling as they began to write. This time, the words were clear. You cannot run from what you owe. When I woke up, I was lying on the floor of my workshop, my hands covered in black ink. The drawer was gone. Since then, I felt like I'd be watched, even in my own home. Sometimes I'll catch movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow slipping around a corner, the faint shape of a figure in a window. I've stopped working on furniture altogether, but the whispers haven't stopped. I don't know what I owe, or to whom, but I'm afraid that one day I'll find out. After that last encounter, I was too terrified to stay in my home. I packed a bag with the essentials, threw it into my car, and drove with no real destination in mind. I just needed to get away, to outrun the shadows I felt creeping ever closer. Every turn of the wheel felt like a temporary reprieve, but deep down, I knew it wasn't enough. The whispers weren't bound by geography. They followed me. In motel rooms, gas station restrooms, even crowded diners, I'd hear faint murmurs, the same unintelligible hisses that now felt like a cruel joke. Sometimes, I thought I caught the word return, spoken in that guttural tone that raised every hair on my body. One night, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I pulled into a truck stop and sat in my car, trying to steady my breathing. I opened my phone and searched for information on J. Edgar's shop, hoping for some clue, but there was nothing. No website, no business listing, not even a historical record. It was as if the place had never existed. As I scrolled in frustration, a new notification popped up on my screen, an email with no subject line, from an address I didn't recognize. Against my better judgment, I opened it. The message was just one line: "You can't run forever." Attached was a photo. My breath caught in my throat when I saw it. It was a picture of me, taken from behind the wheel of my car at that very truck stop. I twisted in my seat, heart pounding, scanning the lot for anyone with a phone or camera, but there was no one. That night, I decided to face whatever this was head on. I couldn't keep running. If I was being haunted, hunted, or whatever this was, I needed answers. I drove back to where I'd first found the shop, though I knew it would probably be futile. Sure enough, the lot was empty, just cracked asphalt and tufts of weeds where the building had stood. I sat in my car, staring at the emptiness, wondering what to do next. And then I heard it, a deep, resonant creak, like wood being pushed open. I turned toward the sound and froze. The shop was there, fully intact, its weathered sign swinging gently in the wind. The light inside was dim, but it glowed faintly, beckoning me. I didn't want to go inside, but my body seemed to move on its own. The door opened before I could reach for it, and a rush of stale, musty air hit me. The interior looked exactly as I remembered: the towering shelves, the cluttered aisles, the faint scent of old paper and varnish. At the back of the shop, the desk stood waiting. The elderly shopkeeper was nowhere to be seen. Instead, there was a figure I hadn't seen before, standing motionless in the shadows. Its features were obscured, but its presence was suffocating. Why me? I managed to choke out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it gestured toward the desk. I knew what it wanted. With trembling legs, I approached the desk and sat down. The quill and paper were waiting for me, just as they had been in my dreams. My hands moved without my consent, picking up the quill and dipping it into the ink. The words that flowed from me this time weren't mine. They spilled out in a language I didn't recognize, a script that looked ancient, looping, and sinister. The air around me grew colder with every stroke of the pen, and I felt like something was being pulled from inside me, something vital. When the last word was written, the paper ignited, burning away in an instant without leaving a trace. The desk, too, began to crumble, the wood splitting and splintering as if it had waited centuries to fall apart. I bolted for the door, not looking back. When I turned around in the parking lot, the shop was gone again. It's been weeks now. The whispers have stopped, and I haven't had any more dreams. But every now and then, I catch a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision, a shadow where there shouldn't be one, the faint sound of wood creaking. I don't know what I gave that thing, and I'm terrified to find out. About a year ago, I got a seasonal job at a remote observatory. My role wasn't glamorous. I wasn't analyzing the stars or working with astronomers. I was just the night technician, ensuring the equipment functioned, the temperatures stayed regulated, and everything remained clean for the scientists who'd arrive in the morning. The observatory was perched on a mountain, surrounded by a thick blanket of mist and silence. Nights were uneventful, save for the occasional owl or rustle of the wind through the trees. Most of my time was spent in the control room, a circular space with computers, monitors, and large windows that offered an endless view of the dark sky. One particularly quiet night, I was alone in the control room, staring out into the blackness. The observatory's equipment hummed softly, almost hypnotically. I had just finished logging some data and was about to grab a snack when I noticed something odd on one of the external cameras. The observatory had a few security cameras positioned around its perimeter to deter wildlife and monitor weather conditions. On one of the feeds, I saw movement, a faint, flickery shadow crossing the lower part of the screen. It wasn't an animal, it moved too smoothly, almost like a person. I leaned in, squinting at the monitor. The figure appeared to be walking toward the main entrance. The building was locked, and as far as I knew, no one else was scheduled to be here that night. Thinking it might be a lost hiker, I grabbed my flashlight and headed for the door. When I stepped outside, the cold mountain air hit me, and the silence was deafening. My flashlight beam cut through the mist, but there was no sign of anyone. I called out, "Hello, do you need help?" No response. I went back inside, locking the door behind me. Back in the control room, I rewound the footage, hoping to figure out where the figure had gone. But when I played it back, the screen was blank, no movement, no shadow, nothing. It was as if the figure had never been there. I brushed it off as a glitch or my tired eyes playing tricks on me. But an hour later, the power flickered, the hum of the machine stuttered, and the lights dimmed for a split second before everything returned to normal. I checked the equipment, but nothing seemed out of place. That's when I saw it. On the far window of the control room, there was a faint outline of a handprint. It wasn't there before, I was sure of it. The glass was cold, and the print seemed to have been made from the outside. I froze, my mind racing. There was no way someone could reach that window. It was on the second floor, and there was no ledge or access point. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in the control room, every light on, clutching my flashlight and staring at the monitors. The handprint stayed there until dawn, fading as the sunlight hit the glass. The following morning, I reported the incident to my supervisor, but they brushed it off as a prank or an overactive imagination. I stayed for the remainder of the season, but I never felt alone in the observatory again. After that night, the observatory didn't feel the same. What once felt serene and isolating now felt oppressive and unnervingly watchful. I tried to shake the unease, convincing myself that I'd been overtired, that my imagination had gotten the best of me, but the little signs kept adding up. One night, about a week after the handprint incident, I noticed something else strange. As I made my rounds, I heard a faint tapping sound, like something tapping on glass. At first, I thought it was the wind or maybe a loose cable brushing against the side of the building, but the sound wasn't coming from outside, it was coming from the telescope dome itself. The dome was massive, housing the main telescope, and was accessible only by a spiral staircase locked at the bottom. No one but authorized personnel had the key, and I was the only one there that night. I hesitated, heart pounding, before climbing the stairs to investigate. As I reached the top, the tapping stopped. The room was deathly silent except for the low mechanical hum of the telescope's motors. I scanned the room with my flashlight. Nothing seemed out of place, but the air felt heavy, like I was being watched. Then, as I turned to leave, I saw it, another handprint, this time on the inside of the dome's observation window. It was larger than the one on the control room window, smeared slightly as if whoever made it had dragged their fingers down the glass. I backed away slowly, heart racing, and locked the door behind me as I left. I didn't go back to the dome for the rest of my shift. The final straw came a few nights later. I was in the control room, trying to distract myself with work, when the sound of static crackled over the intercom system. The observatory wasn't equipped with a functioning POS system, at least none that I had ever used. The static grew louder, punctuated by faint, garbled whispers. I couldn't make out what was being said, but the tone was low, almost pleading. I stared at the speaker, frozen. Suddenly, the static stopped, replaced by a single, clear word, leave. I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed my things and left the observatory that night, not bothering to finish my shift. I didn't even bother clocking out. I drove down the windy mountain road as fast as I could, not stopping until I was miles away. I quit the next day, telling my supervisor I couldn't handle the isolation anymore. I didn't mention the handprints, the whispers, or the tapping. I didn't want to sound crazy, but I also didn't want to stay in that place another second. To this day, I don't know what I experienced at the observatory. Maybe it was all in my head, a result of too many long nights and too much coffee, or maybe something else was up there with me, something that didn't want me there. I didn't think much about the observatory for months after I quit. I avoided mentioning it to anyone, even close friends, afraid of how ridiculous it might sound. But as time passed, little little things began to creep back into my life, things that reminded me of those nights on the mountain. It started small. At home, I'd hear faint tapping on my apartment windows late at night, even though I lived on the 3rd floor. Once, I convinced myself it was a bird, but when I looked out, the window was clear except for a faint smudge, as though someone or something had pressed their hand against it. I shrugged it off. It's coincidence, I told myself, but then I started hearing static in the middle of the night. It wasn't on my TV or my phone. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, like a distant whisper carried on the air. Then the dream started. In these dreams, I was back in the observatory. The control room was bathed in dim red light, and the monitors flickered erratically. I'd feel the same oppressive weight, like I was being watched, though I never saw anyone. The dreams always ended the same way, with me looking at the large telescope's dome and seeing a figure staring at me from the observation window. Its face was obscured, but its hand pressed against the glass was unmistakable. One night, I woke up from the dream, drenched in sweat, and immediately noticed the faint scent of cold metal in the air, just like the control room of the observatory. My stomach churned as I realized the tapping on my bedroom window had returned. This time, it was steady and deliberate, like someone was trying to get my attention. Terrified but unwilling to stay frozen in bed, I grabbed my phone and flashlight and approached the window. My hands trembled as I peeled back the curtain. There was nothing there, but on the glass, clear as day, was a handprint, larger than my own. I couldn't stay in my apartment that night. I grabbed my keys and drove aimlessly for hours, ending up at a well-lit diner on the edge of town. I stayed there until sunrise, the dream and the handprint replaying in my mind. Desperate for answers, I contacted one of the astronomers from the observatory, a soft-spoken man named Dr. Calloway. He was surprised to hear from me but agreed to meet for coffee. I didn't tell him everything, only that I'd experienced strange things while working there. Dr. Calloway went quiet, his face pale. He confessed that I wasn't the first to report odd occurrences at the observatory. Staff had complained for years about strange noises, equipment glitches, and shadows in the corners of their vision. But what disturbed me most was when he mentioned the history of the observatory. Decades ago, during the observatory's construction, a worker had fallen from the dome while performing maintenance. The death was ruled an accident, but some staff believed the worker's spirit lingered, tied to the place where his life had ended so abruptly. Hearing this, I felt a chill run down my spine. The handprints, the tapping, the whispers, could they all be connected to this worker's restless spirit? Or was it something else entirely, something darker? Dr. Calloway suggested I let it go and try to move on. But the truth is, I'm not sure I can. Whatever followed me from that observatory doesn't feel like it's ready to let me go. Now, every so often, I wake up in the middle of the night, feeling that same oppressive weight I felt in the control room. I never open my windows anymore, no matter what I hear outside. I had just moved to a new city for work and didn't have a place secured yet, so I rented a small furnished apartment and put most of my belongings into a storage unit. It was one of those 24-hour access facilities where you punch in a code at the gate and drive right up to your unit. My job kept me busy, so I usually stopped by late at night to grab things I needed. One night, around 11 p.m., I pulled up to my unit. The lot was mostly empty except for a couple of other cars near the far end. The place had bright overhead lights, but the rows of storage units stretched out into dark, unlit areas where the lights didn't quite reach. I punched in my code, the gate rattled open, and I drove to my unit near the middle of the lot. After unlocking the door, I pulled it open, revealing the tightly packed boxes inside. I was looking for a specific kitchen appliance, so I started shifting things around. That's when I heard a sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I realized it was a soft, rhythmic tapping. Tap, tap, tap. I stopped moving and listened. It was coming from further down the row. I glanced in that direction, but the way the lights were spaced out, it was just a wall of darkness past a few units. I shook it off and kept looking through my boxes, but then it came again. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't random. It was deliberate, like someone was knocking on a storage unit door. I stood still, suddenly hyper aware of how alone I was. Then a voice. You need help. I jumped. The voice came from a few units down in the dark. It was low, almost too casual, like the person already knew me. I couldn't see anyone. I didn't respond. Instead, I moved slowly toward my car, trying to act natural. The last thing I wanted was to seem scared and make myself a target. Then I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. Closer this time. I didn't look back. I just got into my car and locked the doors. As I started the engine, my headlights flooded the row of units. That's when I saw it. A storage unit a few doors down was slightly open. Not much, just a crack, just enough for someone to peer out. The tapping had stopped. I backed out quickly, my hands shaking on the wheel. As I turned toward the exit, I risked one last glance in my mirror. The storage unit door was now completely completely open, and in the darkness beyond, I could just barely make out the shape of a person standing there, not moving, not stepping forward, just watching me leave. I never went back at night again. After that night, I decided I would only visit my storage unit during the day. Even then, I never stayed longer than I had to. I had the unsettling feeling that whoever was in that unit had been watching me before I even noticed. A week later, I stopped by around noon to grab some winter clothes. It was bright, plenty of people were coming and going, and I felt safer. As I walked to my unit, I glanced toward the one that had been opened that night. It was shut now, locked with a heavy-duty padlock. I told myself I had imagined it. Maybe it was just a worker closing up, or someone living out of the unit who didn't want to get caught. I tried to rationalize it, but then I saw something that made my stomach drop. On the metal roll-up door of my own unit, near the handle, were 3 small dents. Tiny but deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. I ran my hand over the metal was smooth, like something had been pressed against it repeatedly. My throat went dry. I looked around at that. No one seemed to be paying attention to me. I debated telling someone, but what would I even say? That I was creeped out by some dents. I shook it off, got my clothes, and left. A couple of weeks passed without incident. Then, one night, I woke up to a notification on my phone. The storage facility had motion-activated cameras, and because I had a unit there, I could access the footage if motion was detected near my unit. My heart pounded as I opened the app. The footage was grainy, black and white night vision. At first, I thought there was nothing there. Then, I saw it. A figure, standing directly in front of my unit. They weren't moving, just standing there, facing the door. The timestamp said 2:37 a.m. I stared at the screen, hoping the person would just walk away, but for nearly 7 minutes, they didn't move. They just stood there. Then, in the last few seconds of the recording, the person slowly lifted their hand. Tap, tap, tap. The video ended. I felt sick. The next morning, I went straight to the facility office and showed them the footage. The manager, an older guy named Rick, frowned as he watched it. We've had reports of people sneaking in at night, he admitted. Probably a homeless guy looking for a place to sleep. I shook my head. They didn't try to get inside. They just stood there. Rick didn't have an answer for that. I asked if they could check the logs to see if someone had entered with a code. After some digging, Rick confirmed that my gate code hadn't been used that night. Whoever it was had gotten in another way. That was enough for me. I told Rick I wanted to move my stuff out. I wasn't risking another encounter. I asked a friend to come with me that afternoon while I moved my stuff. I didn't tell him everything. I just said I had a weird feeling about the place and didn't want to be there alone. We loaded up a moving truck as quickly as possible. The whole time, I felt like I was being watched. Then, as we were finishing up, my friend nudged me. Dude, he whispered. Look. I turned. The unit down the row, the same one that had been opened that night, was unlocked again. The padlock was hanging loose. The door was open just an inch, and I swear I saw an eye looking out. That was it. I slammed my unit shut for the last time, locked it up, and told my friend we were leaving. As we drove out of the facility, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The unit door was now fully open, and standing in the shadows was a tall figure, watching. I don't know who they were. I don't know how they got in. After getting all my stuff out, I felt like I could finally breathe again. I told myself I was done with that place, that whatever had been happening there was behind me, but it wasn't. A few nights later, I woke up to another notification on my phone. My stomach flipped when I saw it was from the storage facility app, but that didn't make sense. I had moved everything out. I didn't even have a unit there anymore. I opened the app, motion detected, and the footage loaded, and it was another grainy night vision clip. The timestamp said 3:12 a.m. I stared at the screen, confused. My unit should have been empty. It was pointing at my apartment door. Someone was standing outside my door. They weren't knocking. They weren't moving. They were just standing there. I stopped breathing. My head started spinning. How did they know where I lived? Then, just like before, after several minutes of complete stillness, they lifted their hand. Tap, tap, tap. I dropped my phone. I scrambled to call the police. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely press the buttons. While I was on the phone, I ran to my peephole. Nothing. By the time the officers arrived, the hallway was empty. No signs of forced entry, no security footage showing how the person got in or out. The front desk staff hadn't seen anyone suspicious enter the building. It was like they had vanished. The police took a report, but I could tell they didn't think much of it. Probably just a prank. One of them said, it could be someone from the storage facility messing with you since you moved out. That wasn't comforting. I asked my apartment complex to change my locks. They agreed, but I still didn't feel safe. That night, I barely slept, jumping at every sound outside, but nothing happened. For weeks, I lived in constant paranoia. I double-checked my locks. I stopped going out at night. I looked over my shoulder in parking lots, expecting to see someone following me, but I never did. It seemed like whoever they were done. About a month later, I got a call from Rick, the manager at the storage storage facility. Hey, he said, voice cautious. You, haven't been back here since you moved out, right? I felt my stomach tighten. No. Why? Rick sighed. We have to clean out a unit today. The renter stopped paying, and when we opened it up, well, we found something weird. I didn't say anything. I could hear him hesitating on the other end. Finally, he continued. There was a sleepy bag in the corner, and a few old food wrappers. Looks like someone had been staying there. I swallowed hard, but that's not the weird part. He hesitated again, then said there were pictures in there of you. I went ice cold. What? They were taped to the wall. A bunch of them. Some were from our security footage, but some were closer. He cleared his throat. Like, from your apartment complex. I felt like I was going to throw up. Rick exhaled. Look, man, I don't know who this guy was, but he's gone now. The stuff was old, like it had been sitting there for a while. I just thought you should know. I thanked him in a daze and hung up. I never went back to that facility. I never got any more notifications. Whoever they were gone. I hope. I used to live in a city where walking was my main mode of transportation. It wasn't unusual for me to walk several miles a day, often in the early morning or late evening. I enjoyed the quiet, the rhythm of my steps, the way the city softened when the streets were packed with people. One night, I was walking home from a friend's apartment. It was just after midnight, and the air was cool. The streets were completely empty, but they weren't busy either. I took my usual route, cutting through a block of historic buildings with wide, stone steps leading up to their doors. That's when I noticed him. A man was walking a short distance behind me, matching my pace. At first, I didn't think much of it. Plenty of people walk this way, but then I realized something strange. He was counting his steps, not muttering under his breath, not softly, but out loud, clear enough for me to hear. 1, 2, 3, 4. I picked up my pace. He did too. 35, 36, 37. I glanced over my shoulder. He wasn't looking at me. His eyes were fixed on the ground, focused, like he was measuring something only he could see. I turned a corner. So did he. 52, 53, 54. My heart started pounding. I had no idea what his goal was, what would happen when he reached whatever number he was aiming for. I crossed the street without waiting for the signal, practically jogging now. He did the same. 81, 82, 83. I made a sharp left, heading toward a busier street, even though it was a longer way home. If I could just get near people, near noise, near anything normal. And then he stopped. I could hear it, the abrupt silence behind me. I turned my head slightly, just enough to see him standing there, completely still in the dim glow of a street lamp. He was looking directly at me now. 100, that was all he said. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, back the way we had come. I didn't move for a solid minute, just stood there, my breath sharp in my chest. When I finally made myself continue walking, I kept checking over my shoulder, expecting to see him again. But he was gone. I took a different route home every night after that. I never saw him again. I wish I could say that was the end of it, that I went home, locked my door, and never thought about him again. But the truth is, something about that encounter lingered. For weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I walked alone, I felt like I was just a few steps ahead of someone. I'd turn corners sharply, cross streets randomly, anything to make sure I wasn't being followed. Most of the time, there was no one there. Most of the time, one night, about a month later, I was heading home from work. It was earlier this time, around 9 p.m., but the city had already settled into its nighttime rhythm. I had almost convinced myself that I had imagined how eerie that man had been. Maybe he was just some harmless eccentric. Maybe the numbers had meant nothing. I was almost home when I passed a storefront with large glass windows. The place had closed for the night, the inside dark, but the glass was reflective enough to catch movement behind me. Someone was following me, not close, but far enough back that they blended into the shadows. My pulse jumped, but I told myself to stay calm. It could be anyone, a stranger walking the same way, a neighbor heading home. And then I heard it, a single, whispered word, 89. I froze. For a moment, I was too afraid to turn around to confirm what I already knew in my gut. But I had to know. I turned my head, just slightly, just enough to see. The sidewalk behind me was empty. I spun around fully, scanning the street, the alleys, the doorways. Nothing, but I had heard it. I know I had heard it. I hurried home, locking the door behind me with shaking hands. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of my apartment made my skin crawl. Every passing car made me flinch. I sat in bed with the covers pulled up to my chin, heart racing, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. Days passed, then weeks, then months. months, I forced myself to forget, to move on, and I never heard the numbers again until last year. I had moved to a different city by then, a new place with different streets, different routines. One night, I was coming home late, walking down my quiet block when I saw something on my doorstep. A single slip of paper, neatly folded. I picked it up with numb fingers, my stomach twisting before I even opened it. Inside, written in perfect, measured handwriting, was a single number, 100. I moved out the next day. I didn't tell anyone the real reason I moved. Not my friends, not my family. How could I? It sounded insane, paranoid, like some urban legend people tell to freak each other out, but I knew it was real. I moved to a smaller town, somewhere quieter, somewhere I thought no one could follow me. I picked an apartment in a building with security cameras, a lobby with a keycard entry, a unit on the 3rd floor with only one way in or out. I stopped walking home late at night. I drove everywhere. I made sure no one could ever count my steps again. For a while, it worked. Years passed. I started to believe it was over. Maybe it had been a cruel joke. Maybe someone had been playing with me. I still had the note, the one with 100 written on it. I kept it in a locked drawer, like a reminder, but nothing happened until 2 months ago. I was at work, sitting at my desk, when my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. It was just a photo, a picture of my apartment door. I stared at it, my breath caught in my throat. It was taken from the hallway, just a few feet away. Someone had been there. It stood right outside my door. I didn't go home that night. I called a friend, made up an excuse, crashed at their place. I couldn't sleep. I kept checking my phone, waiting for another message, but none came. The next morning, I drove straight home. My apartment door looked normal. No sign that anyone had been there. No note, no scratches, nothing. I should have felt relieved. I didn't. Something felt off. I checked my locks, my windows, my closet, under the bed. Every irrational fear I'd ever had suddenly felt justified. Everything seemed normal until I noticed my bookshelf. One book was missing. I knew exactly which one. I tore through the shelf, running my fingers along the spines, checking twice, 3 times. It was gone. It had been a random thrift store find, a book about old cities and their histories. The kind of thing I picked up on impulse. I hadn't even read it all the way through, but I remembered something. One of the chapters had been about the practice of counting steps in ancient architecture, how certain places were designed with intentional step patterns, ritualistic, symbolic. The idea that certain numbers held power. One of the numbers mentioned 100. I packed a bag and left that same day. I'm in a motel now, trying to decide what to do next. I don't know if this is a warning, a message, a game. I don't know if it's him. My university had a mix of old and new buildings, some dating back to the early 1900 seconds. One of my classes was in a particularly old humanities building, a place with creaky wooden floors, high ceilings, and drafty hallways. The building always had an eerie feel, but nothing ever happened until one evening during finals week. I had stayed late in one of the study rooms on the 2nd floor, cramming for an exam. It was nearly midnight when I packed up my things and stepped out into the dimly lit hallway. The building was mostly empty by then. My footsteps echoed, the kind of sound that makes you feel like you're not alone, even when you know you are. As I made my way toward the exit, I passed a long hallway that led to a single window at the very end. It was an old, warped window with distorted glass, the kind that made everything outside look strangely stretched. I had never thought much about it before, but tonight, something was different. A figure stood just outside the window. At first, I thought it was a trick of the glass, the way old windows can warp reflections. But then I realized the figure was standing outside on what should have been nothing. There was no ledge, no balcony, just a sheer drop to the ground below. I froze. The figure was tall, too tall, its head almost grazing the top of the window frame. The glass distorted its face, but I could see its mouth was open just slightly. I don't know how long I stood there, maybe a few seconds, maybe longer. Then, with unnatural slowness, the figure tilted its head to the side, not like a person does, but like something trying to mimic human movement and getting it just a little wrong. I took a step back. The floor creaked beneath me. The figure's mouth widened. That was enough for me. I turned and ran, bolting down the stairs 2 at a time. When I reached the exit and pushed through the heavy doors, I had to look. I stepped into the courtyard and craned my neck up toward the window. There was nothing there, just the glass, warped and reflecting the empty night. I don't know what I saw that night. I don't want to know, but I never took a class in that building again, and I never ever looked down that hallway. I wish I could say that was the last time I saw it. For weeks after that night, I tried to rationalize what happened. Maybe I was overtired. Maybe the glass was playing tricks on my eyes. But deep down, I knew what I saw wasn't a trick. I avoided that building entirely, choosing different routes across campus even when it made no sense to do so. But one night, about a month later, I had no choice. A friend of mine, Daniel, had left his laptop in one of the study rooms in that same building, and I, being the only one still awake at that hour, agreed to grab it for him. I told myself it would be quick, in and out. It was just after 11 p.m. when I stepped inside. The building was silent, the kind of stillness that made every small sound feel louder. My footsteps echoed as I made my way up to the second floor. The study room was exactly where I left it that night, across from the long hallway with the window at the end. I didn't look. I wouldn't look. I grabbed Daniel's laptop and turned back toward the stairs, keeping my gaze locked forward. My hands felt clammy. The air around me had grown noticeably colder, like the whole building had dropped in temperature. And then a creak, a sound from behind me. I stopped mid-step. My stomach turned to ice. It came from the hallway. Slowly, against every ounce of my better judgment, I turned my head. The window at the end of the hall was open. The old, warped glass was pushed outward, and a faint breeze stirred the heavy curtains. That was impossible. That window had never been openable. And then I noticed something else. Handprints, too dark, smeared handprints streaked the glass, as if someone or something had pushed it open from the outside. The realization sent adrenaline spiking through me. I took one step back toward the stairs, and then I heard it. A soft, raspy whisper, not words, just a sound, like a breath being dragged through something hollow. It came from inside the hallway. I ran. I didn't stop until I was outside, the heavy door slamming shut behind me. I stood there in the cold night air, gasping, my heart hammering against my ribs. The building loomed behind me, dark and quiet. I looked up. The window at the end of the hall was closed again. No breeze, no handprints, just the same warped glass, reflecting the night. I never went back inside that building. A few months later, I transferred to a different university for unrelated reasons. But before I left, I overheard something that still makes my skin crawl. A janitor was talking to a professor about the humanities building, saying it needed renovations. The professor laughed and said something about the window on the second floor. Damn thing's always been weird, he said. They tried sealing it shut years ago, but it never stays that way. Students keep saying they see someone out there. The janitor shook his head. Yeah, well, that'd be quite the trick. The professor chuckled. Why's that? The janitor glanced around, then lowered his voice, but I heard him anyway, because that side of the building, there used to be a fire escape there way back when it collapsed in the 50 seconds, a student fell with it. They never found her body. I didn't say anything. I just left. I left that university, moved across the country, and did my best to forget about what happened. For years, I convinced myself it was just one of those weird, creepy experiences that I'd never fully understand. But sometimes, things don't just stay in the past. It came back. Or maybe, it never really left. It was 2 years after I transferred when it happened again. I had just moved into a new apartment, a small but comfortable place in a city where I didn't know anyone. I worked a quiet job, kept to myself, and thought the thing at the window was far behind me. But one night, as I was getting ready for bed, I felt it, that cold, creeping awareness. I was brushing my teeth, staring at my own reflection, when I felt the hair on my arms rise. The apartment was silent, no wind outside, but suddenly it felt like something had shifted, like I wasn't alone. I turned around slowly, scanning the dimly lit hallway behind me. Nothing. I shook it off and went to bed, telling myself it was just nerves, just old memories bubbling up. Then, at exactly 3:12 a.m., I woke up, not because of a noise, not because of a dream, just woke up. The room was dark, the air felt heavy, thick, like the pressure had changed. My curtains were drawn, but for some reason, I felt a horrible, crushing certainty that if I looked toward the window, I would see something standing outside. The problem of it, I lived on the 6th floor. I didn't look. I turned on my bedside lamp, pulled the covers over my head like a child, and lay there until the sun came up. After that night, small things started happening. My windows, always locked, would sometimes be slightly open in the morning. I would wake up feeling like someone had been in the room, standing just at the edge of the bed. Then, I started noticing the handprints. At first, I thought I was imagining them, just faint, smudged marks near the base of my bedroom window. But one night, after coming home late, I saw it clearly, 2 dark handprints pressed against the glass. From the outside, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone in another apartment had access to the fire escape. Maybe it was a prank. But my building didn't have fire escapes. And the prints, they were too high for anyone to reach. I cleaned them. The next morning, they were back. The last time I saw it, I nearly lost my mind. I had been sleeping with the lights on for weeks, barely getting any rest. I started keeping a knife by my bed, even though I knew deep down it wouldn't help. Then, one night, I woke up again, not at 3:12 a.m. this time, but 3:33. The pressure in the room was worse than ever. The air was thick, suffocating, like I was being smothered. In this time, I couldn't stop myself from looking. I turned my head toward the window, and it was there. Not just outside, inside, something was standing at at the foot of my bed, too tall, head nearly touching the ceiling, arms too long, and the mouth, that horrible, gapy mouth, open. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe as the thing tilted its head, that same wrong movement before it whispered something so quiet, I almost didn't hear it. But I did, and I will never forget it. He left the window open, then the room crashed back into reality. The pressure lifted, the air moved again, the thing gone. I scrambled out of bed, turned on every single light, and refused to close my eyes again until the sun rose. I moved out the next week, broke my lease, left behind half my belongings. I didn't care. I checked every window in my new apartment 100 times. I never slept without a light on, and for a while, nothing happened. But a few nights ago, I got a text from an unknown number. It was just a picture, blurry, warped, like something taken through old, distorted glass. At first, I couldn't tell what I was looking at, but then my stomach turned to ice. It was a window, a familiar window, the one at the end of the hall, and outside of it, something was standing there, tall, head tilted, mouth open. I am leaving town. I don't know where I'll go next, but I don't think it will matter, because I know now it never needed the building, it never needed the window, it just never may. My flight had been delayed multiple times due to storms, and eventually it was cancelled entirely. The airline rebooked me for a morning flight and offered a hotel voucher, but by the time I got through the chaotic customer service line, the hotel shuttle had stopped running. I decided to stay in the airport instead. It wasn't my first time spending the night in an airport, and I figured I'd just find a quiet spot and get a few hours of restless sleep before my early flight. That was a mistake. By 2 a.m., the terminal had mostly emptied out, except for a few scattered travelers curled up on benches or charging their phones. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the occasional crackle of a distant announcement was the only real noise. It was eerie, but not unusual. I found a semi-secluded waiting area near one of the smaller gates, away from the main concourse. There were rows of empty seats, the kind with armrests that made it impossible to lie down properly. Across from me, there was a woman sitting completely still. At first, I didn't pay much attention to her. She was wearing a pale gray dress and long, dark hair that hung over her shoulders. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap. She was positioned in the middle of the row, not at the ends where most people would sit. I assumed she was another stranded traveler, maybe waiting for a morning flight like I was. But then I noticed something strange. She wasn't doing anything. No phone, no book, no luggage, nothing. She was just sitting there, perfectly straight, staring at the blank screen where flight information would usually be displayed. Her posture was rigid, almost unnatural. I kept sneaking glances at her, feeling increasingly unsettled. Something about the way she was positioned made it seem like she was aware of me, even though she never looked in my direction. After about 10 minutes, I got up and moved to a different row of seats, a little further away. As I settled in, I saw her shift slightly out of the corner of my eye. When I looked back, she had turned her head. She was looking directly at me. I froze. Her face was expressionless, her eyes completely unblinking. I tried to act like I hadn't noticed, turning my gaze back to my phone, but my heart was pounding. Then she stood up. I felt a surge of panic. She didn't have any bags, no carry-on, no purse, nothing, just her dress and her blank stare. She stepped away from the row of chairs and walked slowly toward the hallway leading to the restrooms and vending machines. I exhaled, relieved that she was leaving, but then she stopped. Halfway down the hall, she paused, standing perfectly still again. Then, without turning around, she tilted her head back, like she was listening for something. I grabbed my backpack and decided I was done with that corner of the airport. I speed walked back toward the more populated part of the terminal, where a few other stranded passengers were dozing near the food court. I sat there for the next hour, checking over my shoulder constantly. She never came back. Eventually, exhaustion went out, and I dozed off for a little while. When I woke up, the airport was stirring back to life. Business travelers bustled in, early morning flights started boarding, and the eerie stillness of the night before was gone. I convinced myself I had just been overly tired, letting my imagination get the best of me. Maybe she was just a weird traveler. Maybe I had misread the whole situation. Then, as I went to my gate, I passed by the waiting area where she had been sitting. There was a single thing on the seat where she had been, a boarding pass. It was dated 3 days ago. In the decimation, there wasn't one. I stood there for a long moment, just staring at the boarding pass. It was crisp, uncreased, like it had just been printed, but the flight number was missing. The destination field was blank. Only a name was printed on it, passenger Amelia L. I didn't pick it up. Something deep in my gut told me not to touch it. Instead, I scanned the waiting area. The woman was nowhere in sight. There were a few early travelers settling into their gates, oblivious to the fact that someone or something thing, had been sitting there just hours ago, staring at me. A slow, creeping chill ran through me. I knew I needed to get away from that spot, but my curiosity got the better of me. I walked over to the desk at the gate, where a tired-looking airline employee was setting up for the first morning flight. I cleared my throat. Hey, was there a flight here last night? Around 2 a.m. The employee frowned and shook her head. Nope, this gate closes after the last departure around 10 p.m. No red-eye flights from here. That didn't make sense. I nodded, trying to act casual. Weird. I thought I saw someone waiting here. She let out a short laugh. Probably Amelia. My blood went cold. I forced a weak chuckle. Amelia. The woman sighed and leaned on the counter. Yeah, we get reports about her sometimes. The cleaning crew says they see a woman just sitting in the waiting area at night. Always alone. Always staring at the screen. But there's never a record of anyone being there. No security footage. No ticket scans. Just stories. I felt the world tilting slightly under my feet. She, ever do anything? I asked, my voice drier than I expected. The employee shook her head. Not really. She just waits. But a few people have said she follows them when they leave. Never interacts. Just stands there, watching. My mind flashed back to the way she had stood in the hallway, head tilted back as if listening for me. What happened to her? I finally asked. The woman at the counter shrugged. No idea. Maybe just an old urban legend. Or maybe someone who missed their flight and never left. She yawned and turned back to her computer, completely unaware of how hard my hands were gripping the strap of my bag. I turned away quickly, resisting the urge to look back at the empty seat. I made my way to my gate, boarded my flight, and got the hell out of that airport. But even now, years later, whenever I find myself waiting for a flight in an empty terminal, I catch myself scanning the rows of seats, watching, because deep down, I know she's still there, waited for someone to join her. And I wish I could say that was the end of it, that I got on my flight, left that airport behind, and never thought about Amelia again. But that would be a lie, because Amelia, she found me again. It was about 6 months later, different airport, different city. I was on a late night layover, stuck in a mostly empty terminal, just waiting for my next flight. The airport had that same eerie quietness, the kind that only happens between 1 and 4 a.m. when the world feels like it's barely moving. I had almost convinced myself that my experience with Amelia had been some strange, sleep-deprived hallucination. Almost. But then I saw her. I was sitting by a window, watching the distant runway lights flicker in the fog, when I caught a glimpse of movement in the reflection. A woman sitting alone at a row of seats behind me. My stomach dropped. Slowly, carefully, I turned my head to look. There she was. Same pale gray dress, same long, dark hair, same empty stare, fixed on the flight information screen above the gate. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't possible. I was in a completely different state, a completely different airport, but she was there, exactly as I had seen her before. I forced myself to stay calm. Maybe it wasn't her. Maybe this was just some random woman who happened to look like her. Then, as if she heard that thought, she turned her head. Our eyes met, and then she smiled. Not a friendly smile, not a polite, passive one. It was slow, deliberate, like she had been waiting for me to notice her. My body screamed at me to move, to get up, to run, but I was frozen in my seat, heart hammering so loud I thought she might hear it. Then, just like before, she stood up, and she started walking toward me. I grabbed my bag and bolted. I didn't care where I was going, I just needed to get away. I sprinted through the terminal, past empty gates and sleeping passengers, my pulse pounding in my ears. I didn't dare look back. I made it to the main concourse, where a few overnight staff were cleaning near the food court. I stopped, gasping for breath, and turned. She was gone. There was no sign of her. No pale gray dress. No long, dark hair. Just the empty terminal behind me, stretching into silence. I spent the next 2 hours sitting near a security checkpoint, refusing to move until it was time to board. When I finally got on my flight, I felt like I could breathe again. But as I buckled my seatbelt and glanced out the window, I caught one last glimpse of the terminal. And there, standing near the gate, was Amelia. She wasn't smiling anymore. She was just standing there, watching. Waited. I don't fly at night anymore. I take early morning flights, surrounded by crowds and noise, where I know I'm safe. But every time I walk through an airport, I can't help but scan the waiting areas, because I know she's still out there, still waiting, and I know one day, when I least expected, Amelia will find me again. The next time, I don't think I'll be able to run. I used to work at a small independent clothing boutique tucked into the corner of a busy shopping district. It was the kind of place that sold expensive, minimalist clothing to customers who didn't blink at $100 price tags. My shifts were quiet, mostly spent folding the same shirts over and over, occasionally helping customers who wandered in. One evening, about an hour before closing, a man walked in. There was nothing immediately wrong with him. He was just, his clothes were perfectly neat, but they didn't fit him quite right. His jacket was a little too big, his shoes a little too too small. His face was almost symmetrical but not quite, like a slightly distorted reflection in water. I greeted him, and he nodded but didn't say anything. He drifted through the store, his eyes never really landing on any item for too long. I was used to customers browsing in silence, so I didn't think much of it at first. But then I realized something strange. He wasn't looking at the clothing. He was looking at me, not in a creepy, leering way. He just sounded interested, like he was studying me. I tried to ignore it, focusing on refolding a stack of sweaters, but the feeling of his eyes on me wouldn't go away. I finally glanced up at the mirrors lining the walls of the store, and my stomach dropped. He wasn't there. The store had mirrors everywhere, long, sleek panels designed to make the space look bigger. I could see myself, the clothing racks, even the street outside reflected back at me, but not him. He was standing just a few feet away from me, but in the mirror there was nothing. I froze. My brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was standing at the perfect angle where the mirrors weren't catching him. Maybe it was a weird lighting trick. But then he took a step closer. I heard his footfalls, saw the way his presence subtly shifted the air, but the mirror remained empty. I felt my breath hitch. He finally spoke. His voice was low, measured, almost too smooth. "Do you work alone here?" My hands clenched around the sweater I had been folding. "No," I lied. "My manager is in the back." I don't know why I said it. It was an automatic instinct, some primal part of me recognizing that this was wrong. His lips curved into a small smile. "Good," he said. Then he turned and walked out of the store without another word. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped outside, and I stood frozen, my heart pounding. I ran to the door, peering out onto the street. He was walking away, disappearing into the crowd of shoppers. No one seemed to notice him. I glanced back at the store mirror one last time, hoping, praying that I had imagined it, while the empty space where he had stood remained. I closed up early that night. Nothing like that ever happened again. But sometimes, when I'm walking alone at night, I get this feeling like someone is watching me, and every time I catch my reflection in a window or a puddle on the ground, I'd have to force myself to look, because I'm terrified that one day I'll see him standing behind me, and I know he won't be in the reflection. I quit the boutique a few months after that night. Not immediately. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that it was just a trick of the light, a stress-induced hallucination. But deep down, I knew better. The feeling of unease never really left after that encounter. Even after I left the job, I couldn't shake the paranoia. I started checking my reflection more often, windows, car mirrors, even my phone screen when it was dark. Always looking for him. For a while, nothing happened. Then, one night, it did. I was walking home late from my new job at a coffee shop, earbuds in, hoodie up, the city lights buzzing around me. The streets were empty, but they weren't crowded either, just enough people that I wasn't alone, but not enough that I felt safe. Then I felt it, that pressure on the back of my neck, that awareness of being watched. I told myself I was imagining it, but I still slowed down and casually glanced at a shop window as I passed, and there he was, standing across the street, staring right at me. My stomach turned to ice. It was the same man from the boutique, same slightly too big jacket, same distorted symmetry to his face. But something was different now. His expression. That night at the boutique, he had looked curious. But now he looked like he knew me. And he was smiling, a slow, patient smile. I ripped my earbuds out and picked up my pace, my heart hammering. I didn't want to run. Something in my gut told me that running would make it worse. I turned the next corner without looking back. My apartment was only a few blocks away. I just had to make it there. I walked faster. My hands were shaking. I forced myself not to check another window. I didn't want to see if he was still there. But then, the street lights flickered just for a second, just long enough to make my heart lurch, and when they came back on, he was standing in front of me. I stopped so fast I nearly tripped. My breath caught in my throat. He hadn't walked there. He hadn't moved there. He had just appeared. My body locked up. Every survival instinct screamed at me to move, but I couldn't. He smiled wider, still working low, and my mouth was dry. I couldn't speak. He tilted his head slightly, like he was waiting for an answer. Then, without another word, he stepped back into the shadows between two buildings. I stood there, shaking for what felt like forever. When I finally forced myself to move, I sprinted the rest of the way home. I double-locked my door. I shut every curtain. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. I don't know what he is. I don't know why he's interested in me, but I do know one thing. He's still out there, and I think he's waiting for something. I don't want to find out what. After that night, I stopped going out alone after dark. I changed my route home from work. I even switched apartments, moving across the city to a building with better security. It helped. For a while, I told myself it was over, that whatever he was, whoever he had lost interest. I was wrong. It started with the mirrors. One morning, I was getting ready ready for work, brushing my teeth in my tiny new bathroom. My mirror was slightly fogged from the shower, and as I wiped it down, I saw something that made my blood turn cold. A fingerprint, a single, smudged print near the bottom corner of the mirror. It wasn't mine. I live alone. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I touched the mirror without realizing. Maybe it was there before, and I just hadn't noticed. But then it happened again and again. Every few mornings, I would find new prints. Sometimes just one, sometimes several, as if someone had pressed their fingers lightly against the glass, just barely touching it. I started cleaning the mirror obsessively. I even bought a new one, but no matter what I did, the prints always came back. Then, one night, I woke up to the sound of my bathroom faucet running. I lay in bed, heart pounding. I hadn't left it all. I was sure of that. I forced myself to get up. My legs felt like lead as I made my way to the bathroom. The door was slightly ajar, the light off, the sink was on, and the mirror was covered in handprints, not just fingerprints, full, open-palmed handprints smeared across the glass like someone had been pressing against it over and over. I backed out of the bathroom so fast I nearly tripped. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands and snapped a picture before running out of my apartment. I didn't go back inside until the sun was up. The picture was blurry, but the handprints were there. That was when I knew he hadn't lost interest. He was getting closer. After that, I did something I had sworn I would never do. I told someone. I don't have a lot of close friends, but I reached out to my coworker, Natalie. She was the kind of person who always seemed to know things, old folklore, weird urban legends. If anyone could help me make sense of this, it was her. She listened carefully as I told her everything. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time, then she said something that made my stomach drop. "You need to stop looking for him." I frowned. "What do you mean?" The words sent a shiver down my spine. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, old-looking key. "Put this in your window." "What?" It's just something my grandmother used to say," she explained. "A key in the window locks things out. It won't stop him completely, but it might slow him down." It sounded ridiculous, but at this point, I was willing to try anything. That night, I placed the key in my bedroom window. I didn't check my mirrors. I kept my head down. For the first time in weeks, nothing happened. The mirror was clean the next morning. No fingerprints, no handprints, no running water. It's been a few months now. I still don't look in mirrors for too long. I still keep the key in my window, and so far, he hasn't come back. But some nights, when I'm walking home, I still feel it. That pressure, that awareness, like something is waiting. And every now and then, I swear, just out of the corner of my eye, I see a reflection that doesn't belong. I was driving across the country for a new job. It was late, and I had been on the road for hours when I decided to pull off the highway for some food. I found a small 24-hour diner just outside a quiet town, the kind with flickering neon signs and vinyl booths that look like they haven't been updated since the 70s. The place was nearly empty, except for an older man in a trucker hat nursing a coffee at the counter and a waitress who looked half asleep. I slid into a booth near the window and ordered a burger and coffee to keep me awake. While waiting for my food, I noticed a strange detail. The last booth in the diner, way at the back, was completely blocked off by a velvet rope, like the kind you'd see at a movie theater. The lights above it were dimmed, casting it in shadow. There was a small sign hanging from the rope that just said, "Closed for maintenance." I didn't think much of it at first, but then I realized something that sent a small chill up my spine. Despite being closed, the salt and pepper shakers were arranged neatly on the table. The napkin dispenser was full. A glass of water, untouched, sat at the edge. It was set up as if someone was supposed to be sitting there. I turned to the waitress when she brought my food. "Hey, is that booth actually broken or something?" I asked, gesturing to the back. She froze for half a second. It was subtle, but I noticed. Then she smiled in a way that didn't quite reach her eyes and said, "Oh yeah, it's just old." That answer didn't satisfy me. The diner itself was old, but nothing else was blocked off. No other seats were under maintenance. But I let it go and started eating. A few minutes later, the man at the counter stood up, paid his bill, and walked out, leaving just me and the waitress. The diner was silent except for the faint buzz of the overhead lights. That's when I heard it. A soft creak, like someone shifting in their seat. I looked up, and my stomach dropped. The glass of water at the last booth had moved. It had been near the edge before, but now it was closer to the middle of the table. I hadn't seen it move. I hadn't heard anything other than that small creak. I glanced at the waitress, but she kept her eyes down, scribbling in her notepad even though there were no new orders. Then another sound, a slow, deliberate tap, like someone was drumming their fingers against the table. I don't know why, but I felt an overwhelming sense of wrongness. My brain was screaming at me to get out of there. I forced myself to look at the booth again. The water glass was now on the other side of the table, closer to my side of the diner. I didn't hear it slide, and I didn't see it move, but it had. I grabbed my wallet and threw a 20 on the table. The waitress finally looked at me then, her face completely unreadable. "Drive safe," she said, like she knew I wasn't sticking around. I nearly ran to my car. As I pulled onto the road, I glanced back through the diner's window. The last booth was still in shadow, but the glass of water, it was now sitting on the very edge of the table, like someone was reaching for it. I don't know what would have happened if I had stayed to see, and I don't want to know. As I sped down the empty highway, I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see something or someone following me. The diner disappeared into the night, its neon sign shrinking into a faint red blur in the distance. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had left something unfinished, like I had narrowly avoided being part of something much worse. I drove for another hour before deciding I needed to pull over at a rest stop to clear my head. I parked near the entrance and locked my doors just in case. The rest stop was quiet, just a vending machine buzzing under the fluorescent lights and a single car parked a few spots away. I reached for my phone to check the map, but my hands were shaking. I told myself it was just Merrick's. I had been driving too long. My mind played tricks on me. The glass of water could have been the waitress moving it when I wasn't looking, or maybe my exhaustion had made me imagine things. But then, tap, I froze. It was the same sound. That slow, deliberate tap I had heard in the diner. I turned my head so fast my neck cracked. Nothing. The rest stop was empty. The other car was still parked, unmoving. Tap. It was coming from my passenger side window. I hadn't seen anyone approach. My doors were locked, but there was no mistaking it. Someone or something was on the other side of that glass. I forced myself to look. At first, I thought there was nothing there, just my own reflection in the dim light. But then I saw it. A faint smudge just below eye level, like a fingertip pressed against the glass. I couldn't breathe. I didn't move. The smudge dragged downward, slow and steady, like someone was running their hand down the window. But there was no one there. I fumbled with the keys, starting the car so fast my tires screeched as I pulled out of the lot. My heart was pounding, my skin crawling. I didn't stop driving until I reached a motel on the outskirts of the next town. I didn't care how run down it was. I just needed to be inside, away from my car, away from that highway. I locked the door, shoved the dresser in front of it for good measure, and sat on the bed, trying to calm my breathing. I didn't sleep at night. By morning, I had almost convinced myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Almost. But when I went back out to my car, my stomach dropped. There, on the passenger side window, was a perfect outline of a handprint, and on the hood of my car, written in the thin layer of dust, CO.AG. I took a different route to my destination, avoiding that stretch of highway entirely. I don't know what I almost met that night in the diner. I don't know how it followed me, and I don't ever want to find out. I didn't stop driving until I reached the city. The moment I saw the skyline rising up ahead, I felt some of the tension in my chest loosen. I checked into a different motel, one that was well lit and had plenty of people around. I parked my car right under a street lamp, locked the doors twice, and tried to convince myself that I was safe. But the unease never left me. I kept replaying everything in my head. The closed off booth, the moving glass of water, the tapping, the handprint, and the message, CO.AG. I wasn't sure if it was a threat or a promise. That night, I forced myself to sleep, but it wasn't restful. I kept waking up to every small noise, convinced something was in the room with me. At one point, I could have sworn I heard tapping again, but it was faint, like it was coming from somewhere just outside my window. I was on the second floor. By morning, I was exhausted, but I had to keep moving. I grabbed coffee at the motel lobby, avoiding eye contact with anyone, and got back on the road. The rest of the drive was quiet. There were no strange sounds, no smudges on my window, no eerie messages. By the time I reached my new apartment, I was starting to feel ridiculous. Maybe it had all been paranoia. Maybe I'd scared myself over nothing. I kept telling myself that as I unpacked, set up my furniture, and settled in. For a while, nothing happened. Weeks passed, then months. I started my new job, made friends, and eventually stopped thinking about that night. Until one evening, almost a year later, I had been working late, and by the time I got home, it was nearly midnight. My apartment building was quiet, most of the residents already asleep. I walked into my unit, set my keys down on the counter, and went to grab a glass of water. When I opened the cabinet, I froze. One of the glasses was already full. I hadn't poured it. I hadn't touched any of them since morning, and it was sitting there, right at the edge of the shelf. My stomach turned to ice. I stepped back, trying to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe I'd forgotten I left it there. But then I heard it. A single, deliberate tap, not from the kitchen, not from my bedroom, from inside the hallway closet. I stared at the door. It was closed, locked. I hadn't opened it in days. I backed away slowly, heart hammering in my chest. I grabbed my keys and walked out of the apartment without looking back. I didn't sleep at home that night. I didn't sleep at home the next night either. A few days later, I broke my lease and moved across town. I never went back to that apartment. I don't know what was in that closet or how it had followed me for so long, but I do know one thing. It never needed to rush, because no matter where I go, no matter how far I run, it's always waiting. I work at a university, but not as a professor or researcher. I'm in inventory management. My job mostly involves keeping track of the expensive equipment various departments order, storing surplus items, and occasionally dealing with asset disposal. It's a lot of paperwork and movie boxes around, but it's quiet, and I like that. One of the less glamorous parts of the job is dealing with old lab equipment, some of which is radioactive or otherwise hazardous. We have a designated storage building for these materials, which the university uses as a temporary holding site until a disposal company collects them. It's an old, squat structure, more warehouse than lab, and it's been largely unused for years except for this purpose. One evening, I was finishing up late. The disposal team was scheduled to arrive the next morning, so I had to double check that everything was accounted for. I made my way across campus, my breath fogging in the cold air, and unlocked the heavy metal doors to the storage building. Inside, the place was dimly lit, with rows of old shelving units stretching toward the back. Some were filled with outdated computers, old lab machines, and rusting filing cabinets. Others held sealed containment boxes, the kind you weren't supposed to open. The air smelled of dust, chemicals, and something faintly metallic. I was checking the manifest when I heard it, a shuffling sound, somewhere toward the back of the room. At first, I figured it was just the building settling. It was old, and sometimes the metal walls creaked with temperature changes. But then I heard it again, slow, deliberate footsteps. I called out, "Hello," thinking maybe campus security was making rounds. No response. I pulled out my phone to use the flashlight and aimed it down the narrow aisle between the shelves. The beam caught something that shouldn't have been there. A man stood halfway down the aisle, partially obscured by a metal shelf. He was wearing a white lab coat, but it was old, yellowed, and too big for him, like it belonged to someone else. His face was thin, wrong, with deep-set eyes and skin stretched too tightly over his bones. He wasn't moving. He was just watching me. A shock of fear went through me, and I stepped back instinctively. "This is a restricted area," I said, forcing my voice to stay even. "You can't be in here." He tilted his head slightly, as if considering my words. Then he smiled, a wide, unnatural grin that sent ice through my veins. I turned and bolted toward the exit. Behind me, I heard the unmistakable sound of feet moving fast, the shuffle turning into an urgent, erratic sprint. I reached the doors, fumbling with the lock, when I heard him stop just behind me. I didn't dare turn around. A voice, dry and rasping, far too close, whispered, "I had one just like you." The lock clicked. I threw myself outside, slammed the door shut, and locked them behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped my keys. Campus security arrived a few minutes later. They searched the building thoroughly. There was no sign of the man, and nothing was missing. But in the far back of the storage building, they found something. An old lab ID badge, buried under dust and debris. The photo was faded, but the name was still legible. I looked at it, my stomach twisting into knots. The ID belonged to a lab technician who had gone missing in 1978. I wish I could say that was the end of it, that I left the building that night, and the strange man in the borrowed coat was never a problem again. But that's not how this works, is it? The university wrote it off as a break-in. They figured some homeless guy had managed to slip in, maybe even living there for a while. But that didn't explain the ID badge. It didn't explain the way he moved, or how he vanished. And it didn't explain what happened after. A week passed. I avoided the storage building like the plague. I was rattled, but I still had a job to do, and campus security swore they'd reinforce the locks. Still, I started noticing things. Small things at first. My office door would be unlocked in the morning, even though I was always the last to leave. The inventory sheets for the hazardous materials section were being moved, just slightly out of place, as if someone had been flipping through them. The security cameras covering the storage building would randomly glitch at night, the footage going static for just a few seconds. But the worst part, every time I walked across campus at night, I started feeling like I was being watched. It didn't matter if I was alone or in a crowd. The sensation was always there, a weight behind my back, a shadow just beyond my vision. Then, on a particularly cold evening, I passed by one of the large glass windows of the science building. I saw my reflection, and standing just behind me, barely a few feet away, was a thin figure in a white lab coat. I spun around so fast I nearly tripped. There was no one there, but the feeling of being watched, it lingered. It was so strong I could barely breathe. I ran home that night. I told myself I was just shaken up, that my brain was playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. The last time I encountered him was 3 nights later. I had just wrapped up a late shift. My car was parked near the science building, where most of the research labs were. The campus was empty, eerily quiet. As I walked toward my car, I saw something that made my stomach drop. The driver's side door was open. I stopped. My keys were in my pocket. I knew I had locked it. The overhead light inside the car flickered, revealing something in the passenger seat. A white lab coat. It was folded neatly on the seat, like it was waiting for me. I took a step back, my breath turning to ice. The moment I did, the overhead light flickered again, and for just a second, just a split second, I saw a figure standing at the far end of the parking lot. Thin, too tall, too still, watching me. That was enough. I turned and ran back toward the main campus buildings, toward the security office. I didn't look back. By the time I convinced a guard to walk me back, the lab coat was gone. The car was locked again. Nothing was missing, but I knew what I saw. I put in a request the next morning to transfer locations. I didn't want to work near that storage building anymore. I didn't even want to be on that side of campus. Luckily, they moved me to a different office, one in a newer building, far from the old labs. Nothing happened after that. No more strange figures. No more missing files. No more open car doors. But I still think about that moment in the parking lot. The way he just stood there, waiting. And sometimes, just sometimes, I'll pass by a window at night and catch a glimpse of something white, a shape, watching from the distance, waiting for me to come back. I'd like to say moving to a different building solved everything, that I left whatever was happening behind, and my life went back to normal. It didn't. The sighting stopped, sure, but the feeling didn't. The awareness of something just beyond my vision, the strange sensation that my name had been spoken when no one was around, the creepy paranoia of being watched, it all stayed with me. Then, 6 months later, the incident happened. The university decided to renovate the old storage building. They wanted to clear it out and turn it into a new lab space. I wasn't involved anymore, but I'd overheard a few professors talking about it. Apparently, some of the disposal files were missing, not just misplaced, gone. Even the digital records had been wiped. They figured it was just an error in the system, but I knew better. One afternoon, I got a text from a coworker. Hey, did you hear? Carter went missing. Carter was one of the maintenance guys. He was assigned to help with clearing out the storage building. The last time anyone saw him, he had been sent to take inventory of the old hazardous materials. He never came back. Security footage showed him entering the storage building. There was no footage of him leaving. The doors never opened again. Campus police did a full search of the building, top to bottom. They found his clipboard, his flashlight, still on, lying near one of the containment units. But no Carter, no footprints leading away, no signs of forced entry. It was like he had just ceased to exist. They eventually ruled it as an off-campus disappearance, assumed he left voluntarily despite having no reason to. His family didn't believe it, neither did I. The night after Carter went missing, I had the dream. I was standing in the storage building. It was dark. The shelves stretched endlessly, much longer than they should have. My breath came out in short, sharp puffs, and the air was thick with the scent of old chemicals and metal. I wasn't alone. Somewhere in the rows of shelves, something was moving. Slow, deliberate footsteps, just like before. Then a voice, low and familiar, rasped from the darkness. You should have stayed. I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. When I sat up, I saw something on my nightstand that hadn't been there before. A white lab coat, neatly folded, the same one I saw in my car that night. I didn't touch it. I didn't even breathe. I grabbed my keys, left my apartment, and checked into a hotel for the night. When I returned the next morning, the lab coat was gone. I never saw it again. The university sealed off the storage building after Carter disappeared. No renovations, no conversions, just shut down permanently. Every once in a while, I still dream of the place. The endless shelves, the soft shuffle of footsteps, the faint, chemical scent of something old and forgotten. But the worst part, sometimes when I wake up in the middle of the night, I hear a sound from the hallway outside my bedroom. A slow, deliberate shuffling, like someone standing there, just out of sight, just waiting. I was a history major, which meant a lot of time in university archives, digging through old documents and records. My campus had a large, well-funded archive building, but it also had something else, an auxiliary storage space on the far side of campus, and an older building that used to be the original library. It wasn't exactly abandoned, just rarely used. The main archive was climate-controlled and pristine, while this place was more of a dumping ground for materials deemed low priority. I ended up there a lot because my research focused on obscure local history. It was a quiet, dimly lit place with heavy wooden doors and deep rows of shelves. The first time I noticed him, I assumed he was a fellow student. I was hunched over a stack of records at one of the log tables when I heard someone shifting through a shelf behind me. I turned, expecting to see one of the other researchers. Instead, there was a man, not old, but not young either. He wore a gray cardigan over a button-up shirt and had the kind of face that seemed blurred around the edges like an old photograph. He didn't acknowledge me, just kept running his fingers along the spines of the books. His movements were strange, slow, deliberate. I was about to say something, but he turned and walked away down the road before I could. I saw him again the next time I visited, and again, always in the background, always moving slowly through the shelves, touching books, documents, papers. He never spoke. At first, I chalked it up to an eccentric professor or maybe a local historian with special access. The archive wasn't exactly bustly with people, so it made sense that I'd see the same person multiple times. But something about him unsettled me. I realized, after a while, that I had never seen him enter or leave. One day, curiosity got the better of me. I decided to follow him. I waited until he passed by my table and slipped into an aisle. I kept my distance, careful not to make a sound. He moved through the rows with that same deliberate slowness, fingers grazing old books and folders as if reading them by touch alone. Then, without warning, he turned sharply and walked through a door at the back of the archive. I froze. That door led to a locked storage area. I knew because I had tried it before. Some of the oldest, most fragile documents were kept back there, and only senior staff had the key. I waited a few seconds, then walked over. I pressed my ear against the door. Silence. I turned the handle, not expecting it to give, but it did. The room beyond was dark. No light, no sound. The air was thick with dust, the kind that made your lungs feel heavy. I fumbled for a light switch, my pulse hammering. The overhead fluorescence flickered on, and the room was empty. No other exits, no windows, just rows of shelves, stacked with boxes so old they looked like they might crumble if touched, but no man. I backed out of the room, forcing myself to breathe. I locked the door behind me. I never saw him again after that. I stopped going to the auxiliary archive, finishing my research at the main one instead. I asked a staff member once, casually, if they knew of an older man who worked in the archives, maybe a historian or retired professor. They just frowned and shook their head. That storage room, it hadn't been opened in years. I wish I could say I let it go after that I never thought about it again, but you don't just forget something like that. I tried to rationalize it. I really did. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe my mind had twisted something mundane into something eerie. Maybe there was another exit I hadn't seen. I almost convinced myself, until months later, something changed. I was in the main archive, flipping through old campus records for an unrelated project. That's when I found his name. At first, I didn't even realize what I was looking at. It was just a list of past employees, archivists, librarians, historians. I skimmed past the names until one jumped out at me. A man with a name I won't repeat here. Hired 1946, retired 1972, deceased 1973. I sat there staring at the page, my hands shaking. It was him, the same dull cardigan, the same blurred, almost indistinct features, the same way he moved through the shelves, tracing the books with his fingers. But there was something else, something that made my stomach drop. His position had been archivist of special collections, and the location of his office, that same auxiliary archive, the one with the locked storage room, the one he had disappeared into. I don't know what I saw that day. I don't want to know. All I know is that I never went back, and I hope, wherever he is, he never follows me. For a long time, I avoided thinking about it. I finished school, moved to a new city, started a new job. Life went on, but some things don't stay buried. It was about a year later when I got an email from an old classmate, someone I'd worked with on research projects. She was still at the university, finishing her grad degree, and had started working part-time in the archives. Her message was casual at first, just catching up, but then at the end she wrote, "Hey, weird question, do you remember that old auxiliary archive? The one across campus? Have you ever seen anything off there?" I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. I typed back, trying to sound neutral, "What do you mean?" Her reply came fast, "I don't know, sometimes I feel like I'm not alone when I'm shelving stuff. And the other day, I could have sworn I saw someone moving between the shelves, but when I checked, no one was there. It's probably just my imagination, but it freaked me out." I sat frozen for a long time before I finally responded, "Get out of there." She didn't reply right away. When she finally did, it was just, I didn't know what to say. I didn't want to sound crazy, but I couldn't let it go. So I told her everything. I expected her to laugh it off, or maybe tell me I was paranoid. But instead, after a long pause, she sent another message. "The back storage room. I felt sick. What about it?" I typed. Her response sent a shiver down my spine. "It's been locked since before I started working here. But the other day, I swear I heard something inside, like paper shuffling, or someone moving things around." I didn't respond. I couldn't. A few days later, she quit her job at the archive. She never told me if anything else happened, and I never asked. We drifted apart after that. Some things, I think, are better left unspoken. But sometimes, late at night, I still think about that man. Still wonder if he's there. Still wonder if he's waiting. Alright, but that's it. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But as always,
Have a nice day.